Not kidnapped, not courted, sold. Like cattle at auction, her drunk uncle had traded her future to a man the entire town whispered about in frightened voices. Cade Mercer, the silent rancher who lived alone in the mountains and never explained the scars on his knuckles. Everyone said this marriage would destroy her. The judge wouldn't meet her eyes. The witnesses looked away. Even the preacher rushed through the vows like he was sealing her tomb. But what happened after those courthouse doors opened again? That's when the real story began. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this tale travels. The wagon rattled over frozen ground, and Clara focused on keeping her hands still in her lap. She wouldn't give anyone the satisfaction of seeing them shake. Uncle Frank sat beside her, reeking of whiskey and yesterday's tobacco, humming some tuneless song like he hadn't just bartered away his dead brother's daughter for $300 and a canceled debt. The whole transaction had taken less than an hour. Sign here. Witness there. Congratulations, you're married now. Clara had turned 16 3 weeks ago. Nobody remembered. Nobody cared. You'll thank me someday, Frank muttered, not looking at her. His hands gripped the reins too tight, knuckles white against the leather. Mercer's got land, got money. You could have done worse. Clara didn't answer. There was nothing to say that wouldn't get her backhanded, and she was tired of tasting blood. The town of Copper Hollow disappeared behind them as the wagon climbed into hill country. February cold bit through Clara's thin coat, the only one she owned, and she pulled it tighter, knowing it wouldn't help. The landscape grew rougher, wilder, fewer farms, fewer people, just endless stretches of rocky soil and pine trees that looked black against the gray winter sky. You don't talk much, Frank said suddenly, like he'd been working up to it. Mercer, I mean. But he pays his debts, keeps his word. A pause. That's more than most men. More than you, Clara thought, but kept her mouth shut. She'd seen Cade Mercer exactly once before today, 2 months ago, when he'd come into town for supplies. She'd been sweeping the porch outside Frank's rental room when the rancher rode past on a gray horse that looked mean enough to bite. Tall man, broad shoulders, face like carved stone, all hard angles and no expression. He'd glanced at her for maybe half a second, then kept riding. Every woman in town had watched him go, some with fear, some with something else. Mrs. Patterson from the general store had clutched her cross and whispered, "That man's got the devil's own shadow following him." Then she'd look straight at Clara and added, "You stay clear of men like that, girl. They're nothing but trouble wrapped in silence." Apparently staying clear hadn't been an option. The wagon crested a hill and Frank pulled the horses to a stop. "There," he said, pointing down into the valley below. The Mercer Ranch spread out across the basin like something from a different world. Solid buildings, not the half-rotted shacks Clara was used to. Straight fences, organized corrals, a main house that actually had glass in all its windows, and a roof that looked like it had been repaired this decade. Smoke rose from the chimney in a steady gray column. It looked normal, disappointingly normal. Clara had spent the entire ride preparing herself for some nightmare, a falling-down cabin with blood on the porch and bones in the yard. This looked like a working ranch, a successful one. "Better than I expected," Frank muttered. He flicked the reins and the wagon started down the slope. Clara's stomach twisted tighter with every rotation of the wheels. She tried to remember what the judge had said during the ceremony. The legal words, the binding phrases. But it had all blurred together into white noise and panic, and now she was Mrs. Cade Mercer, whether she understood how it happened or not. The ranch dogs announced their arrival long before they reached the house. 3 of them, barking and circling the wagon with tails up and teeth showing. Not attack dogs, Clara noticed. Working dogs. They settled down the moment a low whistle cut through the air. Cade Mercer stood on the porch. He looked bigger than Clara remembered. Taller, broader. Or maybe that was just because this time she couldn't look away. This time he was hers, legally, permanently. The thought made her want to vomit. "Mercer!" Frank called out, too loud, too cheerful. He hauled the wagon to a stop and climbed down with the exaggerated care of a man who'd been drinking since breakfast. "Got your bride here, all legal and proper, just like we agreed." Cade didn't move from the porch. His eyes, dark, unreadable, shifted from Frank to Clara and stayed there. She felt pinned under that gaze like a butterfly on a board. "She got belongings?" Cade's voice was rough, like he didn't use it often. What she's wearing? Frank gestured vaguely at Clara. I'll send the rest later. They both knew he wouldn't. Clara sat frozen in the wagon seat, her hands still folded in her lap, trying to decide if running would accomplish anything except getting her dragged back in worse condition. The dogs watched her with bright, interested eyes. The horses stamped and blew fog into the cold air. And Cade Mercer just stood there, silent and still, like he was carved from the same stone as the mountains behind him. Finally he moved, 3 steps down from the porch, crossing the yard with a stride that covered ground fast despite looking unhurried. He stopped beside the wagon and looked up at Clara. "You can get down," he said. Not an order, just a fact. Clara's legs felt disconnected from her body as she climbed down, refusing the hand Cade held out because she didn't know what accepting it would mean. She landed harder than she intended, stumbled, caught herself. The dogs came closer, sniffing at her skirt. "They won't bite," Cade said. Clara believed him. It was everything else she wasn't sure about. Frank cleared his throat. "Well then, guess that settles it." He pulled a flask from his coat pocket, took tomatum musco chen, took a drink, wiped his mouth. "You're a married woman now, Clara girl. Mind your husband. Do what he says. Don't cause trouble." He climbed back onto the wagon seat. "Mercer, pleasure doing business." Cade said nothing. The wagon pulled away. Frank didn't look back. Clara watched until it disappeared over the hill, and then there was nothing left between her and her new reality. Just cold air, barking dogs, and a husband who stood 3 feet away, watching her with eyes that gave away absolutely nothing. "You eaten today?" Cade asked. The question caught her off guard. What? "Food. You eaten?" "No." He nodded once, like this confirmed something. "Come on then." He turned and walked toward the house. The dogs followed him immediately, tails wagging. Clara hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to run, but where would she go? Back to town? Back to Frank? She had nothing. No money, no family, no options. So she followed. The inside of the house was warm. Genuinely warm. Not just less cold than outside. A fire burned in a real stone fireplace. The furniture was simple but solid. A table, chairs that matched, a cabinet with actual dishes visible through the glass doors. Clean floors, no bottles, no stains, no smell of rot and desperation. It looked like a home. Clara stood just inside the doorway, dripping melted snow onto the floorboards, not sure what to do with herself. Cade moved through the space with the efficiency of someone who lived alone and knew where everything was. He pulled bread from a covered box, cheese from a cold storage cabinet built into the north wall, set them on the table along with a knife and 2 plates. "Sit," he said. Clara sat. She couldn't remember the last time someone had put food in front of her without demanding something in return first. Cade cut thick slices of bread, added cheese, pushed 1 plate toward her. Then he poured water from a pitcher into 2 cups, set one beside her plate, took the other for himself. He didn't sit, just leaned against the counter, watching her. "Eat," he said. "I'm not hungry." "You're lying." Heat flooded Clara's face. "Excuse me? You said you haven't eaten. Your hands are shaking. You're hungry." He took a drink of water. "So eat." Clara wanted to argue, but her stomach betrayed her with a growl loud enough to echo in the quiet kitchen. She grabbed the bread and ate, hating that he was right, hating that she was this transparent, hating everything about this situation. The bread was good, fresh. The cheese was better than anything Frank had ever brought home. She finished the first slice faster than she meant to and immediately felt ashamed of her desperation. Cade cut more bread without comment, added it to her plate. They stayed like that in silence, her eating, him watching, until Clara couldn't stand it anymore. "What happens now?" The words came out harder than she intended. Cade set down his cup. "Now you finish eating, then I show you the house. Then you decide what you want to do." "I don't understand." "Which part?" "Any of it." Clara's voice cracked despite her best efforts. "You paid for me. Frank said you paid for me. So what do you want?" Something flickered across Cade's face, too fast to read. He was quiet for a long moment, like he was choosing his words with the same care he'd use handling explosives. "I paid your uncle's gambling debt to Thomas Warren at the mill," he said finally. $300. In exchange, your uncle signed papers making me your legal guardian and agreed to— I know what happened. I was there. Then you know this whole thing is crooked as hell. Clara blinked. Whatever she'd expected him to say, it wasn't that. Cade pushed off from the counter, crossed to a shelf near the door, pulled down a wooden box. He brought it to the table, opened it, pulled out papers. Legal documents with seals and signatures. These are copies of the contracts, he said. You're 16. Marriage age in the territory is 18 without parental consent, 15 with it. Your uncle isn't your parent, so the whole thing's legally questionable at best. He spread the papers on the table. But the judge signed anyway because your uncle owed money to half the county and everyone wanted him gone. Clara stared at the documents. I don't understand what you're telling me. I'm telling you this marriage might not even be legal. And if it is, it's built on coercion and debt, which means it can be challenged. Cade leaned back against the counter again. I'm also telling you I'm not going to force you into anything. You want to stay here? You stay. You want to leave? I'll give you money and a horse, and you can go. The room felt too small suddenly, too warm. Why? Claire's voice came out as a whisper. Why would you do that? Cade's jaw tightened. Because I've seen what happens when men treat women like property, and I decided a long time ago I wouldn't be that kind of man. Something in the way he said it made Clara think there was a story there, a bad one. So what do you want from me? She asked. Nothing. He said it flat, final. You're here because your uncle's a bastard, and the law's broken, and this town's full of people who look the other way when it's convenient. You didn't choose this. I'm not going to pretend you did. Clara felt something crack open inside her chest. She'd prepared herself for violence, for demands, for being owned. This unexpected mercy, she didn't have defenses against. There's a bedroom upstairs, Cade continued. It's yours. I sleep down here. There's a lock on your door. I don't have a key. He gestured to the house around them. Food in the cold storage, wood for the fire. You want to work? There's plenty to do on a ranch. You don't want to work? That's fine too. And if I want to leave? Then you leave. Just like that? Just like that. Clara looked down at her hands, still trembling despite the food, despite the warmth. You're lying. People don't just do things like this. Most don't, Cade agreed. But I'm not most people. The silence stretched between them, heavy with things Clara didn't know how to name. Fear, yes, but also something else, something that felt dangerously close to hope. And hope was a luxury she'd learned not to afford. I'll show you the house, Cade said, pushing off the counter. Then you can decide. The tour didn't take long. Downstairs, kitchen, main room, a small bedroom where Cade clearly slept. Clara could see a neatly made bed through the half-open door. Upstairs, 2 more bedrooms, one empty, except for dust, one furnished with a bed, dresser, washstand, and a window that looked out over the valley. This one's yours, Cade said from the doorway. He didn't come inside. There's blankets in the dresser, basin's clean. I'll bring up hot water in the morning. Clara walked to the window, looked out at the landscape painted in shades of gray and white, and dying light. The room was bigger than anywhere she'd slept in her entire life. The lock works, Cade added. Checked it myself this morning. Clara turned to face him. He stood in the doorway, too tall, too broad, taking up too much space just by existing. But he didn't come closer, didn't move at all except to put one hand on the doorframe, casual, like he needed something to do with it. Why? She asked again, because she still didn't understand. Why go through all this? Why marry me at all if you're just going to let me do whatever I want? Cade was quiet for a moment. Then, your uncle was going to sell you to Wallace Grady. The name hit Clara like cold water. Wallace Grady. She knew that name. Everyone knew that name. A rancher east of town with a reputation for cruelty and a string of dead wives nobody talked about in public. I heard him making the deal in the saloon, Cade continued. Grady was offering more money. Would have closed the transaction that night, except I got to your uncle first and made a better offer. Clara's knees felt weak. She sat down on the edge of the bed before they could give out. So this was... She couldn't finish the sentence. Intervention, Cade said. Not ownership. There's a difference. And if I leave? If I take your horse and money and ride out tomorrow? Then you leave. He said it like it was simple, like it didn't cost him anything. But you should know Grady's still looking, and Frank's still in debt. If you go back to town alone, unprotected—" He didn't finish the thought, didn't need to. Clara felt trapped, but it was a different kind of trap than she'd expected. Not a cage, more like being stuck on a cliff with wolves below and strangers offering rope from above. Trust the rope and maybe survive. Refuse it and definitely fall. "I need to think," she said. "That's fine." Cade stepped back from the doorway. "I'll be downstairs if you need anything. Lock's on the inside of the door." He left. Clara heard his footsteps on the stairs, heavy and deliberate, then moving through the house below. She got up, closed the door, turned the lock. It clicked into place with a solid, reassuring sound. Then she sat back down on the bed and tried to figure out what the hell had just happened to her life. Dinner was strange. Cade had called up the stairs that food was ready, then left her alone to decide whether to come down or not. Clara had stayed in her room for another 20 minutes, testing the lock, checking the window, which opened, she noted, and led to a roof she could probably climb down if necessary, and trying to convince herself this wasn't some elaborate setup for something worse. Eventually, hunger won over paranoia. She found Cade in the kitchen, setting out plates of stew that smelled better than anything Clara had eaten in months. He'd set 2 places at the table, both on the same side, not across from each other. It took her a moment to realize why. This way they weren't facing each other directly. Less confrontational, less intimate. "Beef," Cade said, nodding at the pot. "Carrots? Potatoes? It's not fancy." Clara sat down. "It's fine." They ate in silence for a while. Clara kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to make a demand, establish rules, do something that would confirm this was all an act. But Cade just ate his stew, methodical and quiet, like she wasn't even there. "Do you always eat alone?" Clara asked finally, because the silence was starting to feel heavier than conversation. "Mostly." "No ranch hands? No help?" "Had a hand last summer. He moved on." Cade sopped up stew with bread. "I manage alone through winter." "That's a lot of work for one person." "It is." Clara waited for him to elaborate. He didn't. "I can work," she said. "I'm not useless." "Didn't say you were." "But you said I don't have to work if I don't want to." "That's also true." Clara set down her spoon harder than necessary. "You're not making any sense. Either you need help or you don't. Either I'm here to work or I'm not." Cade looked at her then, really looked at her, and Clara felt that same pinned feeling from earlier. "You're here because the alternative was worse. What you do now is up to you. I'm not going to force you into labor just because the law says I can." "The law says you can do a lot more than that." "I know what the law says." "And you just don't care?" "I care," Cade said quietly. "That's why I'm not doing it." Clara didn't know what to do with that. Didn't know what to do with any of this. So she went back to eating, and Cade did the same, and the silence settled over them again like snow. After dinner, Cade washed the dishes while Clara dried them, an arrangement that seemed to happen without discussion. He handed her plate still dripping with water, and she wiped them down and stacked them in the cabinet. It was domestic in a way that made Clara's skin itch with discomfort. "You don't have to do that," Cade said. "I know." Clara grabbed another plate. "But I'm doing it anyway." The corner of his mouth might have twitched, or maybe she imagined it. When the dishes were done, Cade moved to the fireplace and started banking the coals for the night. Clara stood in the middle of the kitchen, suddenly aware that she had no idea what happened next. What was the routine here? What was expected? "There's books," Cade said without turning around. "In the cabinet by the window. You can read if you want." "I can read just fine," Clara said, more defensive than she meant to be. "Good." He finished with the fire, straightened up. "Then help yourself." Clara crossed to the cabinet, more to have something to do than because she actually wanted to read. Inside, she found a surprising number of books. Not many by rich people's standards, but more than she'd expected from a silent rancher living alone in the hills. Mostly practical stuff. Agriculture guides, weather almanacs, a few novels with worn spines that looked like they'd been read multiple times. She pulled out a thin volume at random. Poetry. Robert Frost. "Didn't figure you for poetry," she said before she could stop herself. Cade shrugged. "It was my mother's." "Was." Past tense. Clara didn't ask. She took the book to one of the chairs near the fireplace and opened it randomly, not really reading, just needing something to do with her hands and eyes that wasn't watching Cade Mercer move through his house like a ghost in his own. Clara pretended to read. Cade sat in the other chair, pulled out a whetstone and a knife, and started sharpening the blade with long, methodical strokes that made a rhythmic scraping sound in the silence. It should have been terrifying, sitting across from a man she didn't know, watching him sharpen a knife in the firelight. Instead, it was almost peaceful, like the world had paused for a moment and forgotten to be cruel. "You can ask questions," Cade said without looking up from his work. Clara turned a page she hadn't read. "What? You're wondering things. You can ask." "I don't know what to ask." "That's fine too." But now that he'd opened the door, Clara found she did have questions. Too many. They piled up in her throat, fighting for space. "Why do you live alone?" she asked finally. "I like the quiet." "No family?" "Not anymore." "Friends?" "Some. In town." "But you don't live there." "No." Clara closed the book, gave up pretending to read. "Why does everyone act afraid of you?" Cade's hand stilled on the knife. For a moment, Clara thought she'd crossed some line, pushed too far. Then he set down the whetstone and looked at her directly. "Because I killed a man once," he said, "and this town doesn't forget things like that." The words hung in the air between them, heavy and sharp. Clara's heart kicked against her ribs. What happened? He needed killing. Cade picked up the whetstone again, went back to sharpening. "That's all there is to it." "That's not all there is to it. It's all I'm telling you tonight." "Fair enough." Clara had secrets too. Everyone did. "Does it bother you?" she asked. "That they're afraid?" "Sometimes." The scraping sound continued, steady and unchanging. "Mostly I just ignore it. Must be lonely." "It is." He tested the knife's edge with his thumb, seemed satisfied, set it aside. "But it's better than the alternative." Clara thought about that. About loneliness versus danger. About isolation versus cruelty. About all the ways people hurt each other and all the ways they avoided it. "I'm going to stay," she said quietly. Cade looked up. "For now," Clara added quickly. "I'm going to stay for now, until I figure out what else to do." Something changed in Cade's expression. Not quite relief, not quite satisfaction. Just a slight softening around the eyes. "All right, he said. "That's fine. I'll work. Pull my weight. I'm not going to just sit around being useless. If that's what you want." "It is." Clara stood up, still holding the poetry book. "And I'm keeping this for tonight. It's yours if you want it." Clara nodded, feeling awkward, feeling like she should say something else but not knowing what. "Thank you. For dinner? For everything." Cade just nodded. Clara went upstairs, locked her door, and sat on the bed in her coat because she didn't have night clothes and didn't know if asking for some would be crossing some invisible line. She could hear Cade moving around downstairs, the sound of boots on wood, the creak of his bedroom door opening and closing, then silence. She opened the poetry book and tried to read by moonlight coming through the window, but the words blurred together. Instead, she found herself staring out at the dark landscape, at the valley painted silver and black, at the mountains rising like teeth against the star-filled sky. Tomorrow she'd figure out what staying meant. Tonight, she just needed to survive until morning. Clara pulled the blankets up, fully dressed, and closed her eyes. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she fell asleep without being afraid. The next week passed in a strange, cautious routine. Cade woke before dawn, started the fire, made coffee, left a cup for Clara on the kitchen table, and went out to tend the animals. Clara woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of the front door closing, came downstairs to an empty house, and tried to figure out what she was supposed to do with herself. The first morning, she'd just sat at the table, drinking coffee, waiting for instructions that never came. Eventually, she'd explored the kitchen, found eggs and flour and bacon, made breakfast. When Cade came in 2 hours later, stamping snow off his boots, she'd had food waiting. He'd stopped in the doorway, surprised. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know." Clara set plates on the table. "But I did it anyway." They'd eaten together, and that had set the pattern. By the third day, Clara was getting restless. She'd cleaned the house top to bottom. Not because it was particularly dirty, but because she needed something to do. She'd reorganized the kitchen cabinet. She'd read 2 of the novels. She'd stared out windows and felt like a prisoner in a very nice cell. That afternoon, when Cade came in for lunch, she was waiting. "I want to learn," she said without preamble. Cade hung his coat on the peg by the door. "Learn what?" "Everything. Horses, ranch work, whatever you do out there all day." She crossed her arms. "I can't just sit in this house forever." Cade studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded. "All right, after lunch." So that's how Clara found herself standing in a barn that smelled like hay and leather and animals, watching Cade show her how to properly saddle a horse. "This is Juniper," he said, running a hand along the mare's neck. "She's calm, good for learning." Clara approached carefully. The horse was huge up close, all muscle and warm breath, and eyes that watched her with intelligent wariness. "Give me your hand," Cade said. Clara hesitated, then held out her hand. Cade took it, his palm rough, warm, careful, and guided it to the horse's shoulder. "Firm but gentle," he said. "Let her know you're there. Let her get used to you." His hand stayed over hers for a moment, then pulled away. Clara kept her palm on the horse's coat, feeling the warmth and strength underneath. "She's beautiful," Clara said softly. "She's practical." Cade picked up the saddle blanket. "But yeah, she's also beautiful." He walked Clara through the process step by step. Blanket placement, saddle positioning, how to tighten the cinch without over-tightening, checking the stirrups. His instructions were clear and patient, never condescending, never impatient when she had to try something twice. "Why are you doing this?" Clara asked as she struggled with a particularly stubborn buckle. "Teaching you to saddle a horse?" "All of it. Teaching me anything. You could just keep me in the house." Cade was quiet while he checked her work on the cinch. "My mother used to say the worst thing you can do to a person is make them helpless. Make them dependent." He adjusted the stirrup slightly. "I'm not going to do that to you." "Your mother sounds like she was smart." "She was." Something sad flickered across his face. She was a lot of things. Clara didn't push. She was learning that Cade would share pieces of himself in his own time, in his own way, and demanding more just made him shut down. They spent the rest of the afternoon in the barn. Cade showed her how to muck stalls, how to check hooves for stones, how to tell if an animal was favoring a leg. Clara's hands got dirty. Her back started to ache. She loved every minute of it. By the time they headed back to the house, the sun was setting and Clara felt more tired than she had in days. Good tired. Earned tired. "You did well," Cade said as they walked across the yard. "I barely did anything." "You showed up, you paid attention, you weren't afraid." He glanced at her. "That's more than most people manage their first day." Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest. Pride, maybe, or just the simple pleasure of being seen as competent. That night at dinner, she asked more questions. About the ranch, about the land, about how he managed alone in winter. Cade answered them all, slowly at first, then with more ease as he realized she was genuinely interested and not just making conversation. "How'd you end up with this place?" Clara asked, sopping up the last of her stew with bread. "Bought it 6 years ago. Previous owner died, no heirs, bank was selling cheap." "Where'd you get the money?" "Worked. Saved." He paused. "And I had some inheritance from my mother." "What did you do before this?" "Different things. Logging for a while, worked on the railroad, did some bounty hunting." That last one made Clara look up. "Bounty hunting?" "For a couple of years. Paid well." Cade's expression darkened slightly. "But it wasn't a good life." "Is that when you killed a man?" "No, that was different." He stood up, collected the plates. "And that's enough questions for tonight." Clara let it drop. She was learning the boundaries, learning when to push and when to back off. That night, lying in her locked bedroom, Clara realized she hadn't thought about leaving once all day, hadn't felt the urge to run, hadn't spent every moment calculating escape routes and survival odds. It was dangerous, she knew, getting comfortable, starting to trust. All it would take was one mistake, one moment of letting her guard down, and everything could fall apart. But for tonight, in this warm room with a lock that worked, and a man downstairs who'd kept every promise he'd made, Clara let herself imagine that maybe, just maybe, she'd landed somewhere safe. Sunday arrived with church bells Clara could hear faintly from the valley. She'd been at the ranch for 10 days, and this was the first time she'd really thought about town, about other people, about the world beyond this isolated pocket of land and animals and careful routine. Cade came in from morning chores and found her standing at the window, listening. "You want to go?" he asked. Clara turned. "To church?" "To town. Church. Whatever you want." The offer surprised her. "I thought you didn't go to town much." "I don't, but you might want to." He leaned against the door frame. "You've been here over a week. People will talk if you don't show up eventually. Better to control the narrative than let them make one up." Clara hadn't thought about it like that. "What will they say?" "That I've got you locked up, that you're scared, that you're pregnant, that you're dead." Cade shrugged. "Town doesn't need facts to run its mouth. And if I go, then they'll see you're alive and fine and form new opinions. Probably still wrong, but at least based on actually seeing you." Clara considered. Part of her wanted to stay here, hidden, safe in this bubble they'd built. But Cade was right. Hiding would only make things worse. "I'll go," she said. "All right, we leave in an hour." Clara went upstairs to change, then realized she had nothing to change into. She'd been wearing the same dress for 10 days, washing it every few nights, but it was still just one dress and it was getting worn. She came back downstairs. "I don't have anything else to wear." Cade looked up from where he was polishing his boots. His eyes swept over her, assessing but not leering. "There's a trunk in the empty bedroom upstairs, second floor. My mother's things. Some of it might fit." Clara felt intrusive going through a dead woman's belongings. But she also couldn't show up to town looking like a vagrant. She found the trunk right where Cade said it would be, cedar wood, carefully maintained, full of neatly folded dresses that smelled like lavender and thyme. She chose a simple navy dress with a modest collar, sturdy fabric, nothing fancy. It was a little loose in the shoulders, but otherwise fit well enough. There was a coat too, wool, well made, warmer than her own thin jacket. When she came back downstairs, Cade did a double take. "That was hers," he said quietly. "My mother's. You look—" He didn't finish the sentence, but something in his eyes made Clara's chest feel tight. "I can wear something else," she said. "No. It's good. She'd want it used." He cleared his throat, looked away. "We should go." The ride to town was quiet. Cade drove the wagon with the same methodical competence he applied to everything else, and Clara sat beside him, watching the landscape change from wild to cultivated as they descended into the valley. Copper Hollow looked smaller than Clara remembered, meaner. The main street was churned mud and melting snow. Buildings hunched against the cold like they were ashamed of themselves. People moved between church and home with their heads down, bundled against the wind. Cade pulled the wagon to a stop near the church just as the final bell rang. "You don't have to go in," he said. "We can just be seen and leave." But Clara was already climbing down. "I'm not afraid of these people." It was a lie, but saying it made her feel braver. They walked into church together, late enough that everyone was already seated. The entire congregation turned to look. Clara felt their eyes like brands on her skin. Shock, curiosity, judgment. She kept her chin up and her back straight as Cade led them to a pew near the back. She could feel the whispers starting already, rippling through the crowd like wind through grass. The preacher, a thin man named Holloway who looked like he survived on faith and spite, faltered mid-sentence when he saw them, then recovered and kept going. But his eyes kept drifting back to Clara and Cade, like he couldn't quite believe they were real. Clara barely heard the sermon. She was too focused on surviving the stares, the whispers, the weight of being watched by an entire town that had already decided who she was and what her life meant. After the service, people didn't know what to do with them. Some nodded at Cade from a distance. Nobody approached. Clara felt like she was radioactive, like getting too close might contaminate them with whatever curse had landed her in Cade Mercer's house. Then Mrs. Patterson from the general store broke from the crowd and walked straight up to them. "Clara Whitmore," she said, voice carrying across the church steps. "Or is it Clara Mercer now?" "It's Clara," Clara said evenly. Mrs. Patterson's eyes swept over her, taking in the borrowed dress, the color in her cheeks, the fact that Clara was standing upright and meeting her gaze. Whatever she'd expected to find, this wasn't it. "You look well," she said finally. "Better than expected." "Should I not?" There were concerns. Mrs. Patterson glanced at Cade, who stood silent beside Clara like a mountain. About your welfare. My welfare's fine. Is it really? A younger woman stepped forward. Sarah Bellamy, Clara remembered, the banker's daughter. Or are you just saying that because he's standing right there? The implication hung in the air, ugly and obvious. Clara felt Cade tense beside her, but before he could say anything, Clara stepped forward. If you have something to say, Sarah, say it plainly. I'm saying maybe you're in trouble and can't ask for help. And I'm saying mind your own business. Sarah's face flushed. We're trying to help you. I don't need your help. I don't need anything from this town except to be left alone. That's fear talking, another woman interjected, Martha Hayes, the schoolteacher. We understand you're scared, child, but there are options, legal options. I'm not scared, Clara said, louder now, and I'm not a child. You're 16, Martha said gently, and married to a man twice your age who bought you from your drunk uncle. If that doesn't terrify you, it should. The crowd murmured agreement. Clara felt Cade's hand on her shoulder, light, barely there, and realized he was trying to pull her back, diffuse the situation. But something had broken open inside Clara, all the fear and anger and helplessness of the past 2 weeks flooding out at once. You want to know if I'm being hurt? Clara's voice cut through the murmurs. I'm not. You want to know if I'm locked up? I'm not. You want to know if I'm there against my will? She paused, met Sarah's eyes, then Martha's, then Mrs. Patterson's. I'm there because it's safer than anywhere else in this godforsaken town. Clara, Cade's voice, quiet. No. She shook off his hand. They want to know. Let them know. Where were all of you when Frank was selling me to the highest bidder? Where were you when I was cleaning his vomit off the floor and eating once a day if I was lucky? Where was this concern then? Silence. Heavy and thick. That's what I thought. Clara turned to Cade. I want to leave. They walked back to the wagon through a crowd that parted like water. Nobody spoke. Nobody tried to stop them. Clara climbed up, Cade followed, and they pulled away from the church with every eye in Copper Hollow watching them go. They were halfway back to the ranch before Cade spoke. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. They'll talk worse now. Let them. Clara stared straight ahead, hands clenched in her lap. I'm done pretending to be grateful for scraps of concern from people who never cared before. Cade was quiet for a moment. Then, you're right. They should have helped you sooner. But they didn't. No, they didn't. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Easier, somehow. Like something had been settled between them without needing words. When they got back to the ranch, Clara went straight upstairs and didn't come down until dinner. Kay didn't push, didn't ask questions, just made food and set a place for her at the table like always. That night, sitting across from each other, eating stew in comfortable quiet, Clara realized something had shifted. She'd stopped thinking of this place as a temporary shelter, stopped calculating escape routes, stopped waiting for the cruelty to start. This was starting to feel like home, and that terrified her more than anything Cade Mercer could have done. The weeks after church became a careful dance of boundaries and broken expectations. Clara stopped asking permission for things. She just did them. When she wanted to learn how to fix a fence, she followed Cade out into the north pasture and picked up tools until he showed her what to do. When she wanted to understand the ranch's finances, she found the ledger in his desk drawer and studied it until the numbers made sense. When she got tired of wearing dead women's dresses, she took measurements and fabric from the storage chest and sewed herself 2 new ones by lamplight. Cade watched all of this happen without comment, like he was waiting to see how far she'd push before he pushed back. But he never did. He just adjusted, made space, let her claim pieces of the ranch as her own. It drove Clara crazy sometimes, that patience, that refusal to react. Don't you have opinions? She asked one morning while they were mucking stalls together. 2 weeks had passed since the church incident, and the rhythm they'd fallen into felt too easy, too comfortable. Cade dumped a wheelbarrow of soiled hay onto the compost pile. About what? About anything. About me rearranging your kitchen. About me wearing your mother's coat. About me reading your mail. You read my mail? Last week, the letter from the cattle buyer in Silver Creek. Clara kept working, not looking at him. You're getting cheated on the price. Cade was quiet for a moment. Then, what makes you say that? Because I read the market reports in the newspaper you bring home. Beef prices are up 12% from last spring. He's offering you 8% less than you got then. She finally looked up. Either he thinks you're stupid, or he thinks you won't check. Something flickered across Cade's face. Not anger, something closer to impressed. You're right, he said. I was going to take the deal anyway. Easier than arguing. That's stupid. Probably. He leaned on his shovel. You want to write back to him? Negotiate a better price? Clara blinked. What? You clearly know more about this than I do, and you've got a sharper tongue. Might be you'd get further than me. You're serious. I'm serious. Clara felt something shift in her chest. This wasn't permission, it was trust, and trust was currency she hadn't expected to trade in. I'll draft something, she said carefully. You can read it before it goes out. Don't need to. If you think it's right, send it. That night, Clara sat at the kitchen table with pen and paper, composing a letter to a cattle buyer she'd never met, representing interests in a ranch she didn't own, married to a man she barely understood. The absurdity of it should have paralyzed her. Instead, it felt like the first real thing she'd done in years. She kept the language sharp but professional, cited specific market data, made it clear they knew what their cattle were worth and wouldn't accept less. When she finished, she read it over twice, then sealed it and left it on the table for Cade to post tomorrow. He came in from evening chores, saw the letter, picked it up. You want me to read it? He asked. Do you want to read it? Not particularly. Then don't. Cade pocketed the letter without another word and went to wash up for dinner. Clara watched him go and felt something dangerous blooming in her chest. Not love. She wasn't fool enough to call it that. But something adjacent. Something like partnership. The reply came back 10 days later. The buyer agreed to the higher price and suggested they might do more business in the future. Cade showed Clara the letter without saying anything, but she caught the slight curve at the corner of his mouth that might have been pride. After that, the cattle correspondence became Clara's job. She handled it efficiently, negotiated firmly, and built a reputation through written words with men who would never have taken her seriously face to face. But not everyone stayed distant. Wallace Grady showed up on a Tuesday morning in early March, riding a black horse that looked as mean-tempered as its owner. Clara saw him from the kitchen window and her stomach dropped. "Cade!" she called out, trying to keep her voice level. He appeared from the back room, took one look at her face, then followed her gaze out the window. His expression went flat and cold. "Stay inside," he said. "Like hell." "Clara, I'm not hiding from him." She was already moving toward the door. "If he's here for me, he should have to look at me." Cade caught her arm, gentle but firm. "He's not here for you. He's here to make a point, and I'd rather you not be part of it." "What point?" "That he can show up whenever he wants, that he still sees you as unfinished business." Cade's jaw tightened. "That I took something he considers his." The casual possessiveness in those words made Clara's skin crawl. "I was never his." "I know that. He doesn't." They were still arguing when Wallace dismounted and walked straight up to the porch like he owned it. Up close he was bigger than Clara remembered, tall and broad, with a face that might have been handsome if it wasn't twisted into a permanent sneer. He looked at Clara through the window and smiled. It was the kind of smile that made women lock their doors. Cade stepped outside before Wallace could knock. Clara pressed against the window, watching. "Grady?" Cade's voice carried across the yard, flat and unwelcoming. "Mercer." Wallace tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "Heard you got yourself married. Thought I'd come pay my respects." "You've paid them. Now leave." "Now that's not very neighborly." Wallace's eyes drifted toward the window where Clara stood. "Especially when I rode all this way just to see how the little bride's settling in." "She's fine. You can go." "Can she speak for herself, or have you got her trained already?" Before Cade could respond, Clara opened the door and stepped out onto the porch. Every instinct screamed at her to stay inside, stay safe, but she was done letting men discuss her like she wasn't there. "I can speak fine," she said. "And I'm telling you the same thing he is. Leave." Wallace's smile widened. "There she is. I was starting to think Mercer kept you locked up like a dog." "You were starting to hope," Clara corrected. "Clara," Cade's warning tone, but Wallace laughed, sharp and ugly. "Got yourself a mouthy one, Mercer. That's going to wear thin real fast. Maybe you should have let me make the purchase after all. I know how to handle spirited women." The air between the three of them went tight and dangerous. "You need to leave," Cade said quietly. "Right now." "Or what? You'll kill me like you killed Jack Carson?" Wallace took a step closer. "Everyone knows that story, Mercer. How you beat a man to death with your bare hands and walked away clean because the sheriff owed you a favor." Clara went cold. She had known Cade had killed someone. He told her that much. But beaten to death was different than shot in self-defense or any of the other scenarios she'd imagined. "That's not what happened," Cade said. "No? Then tell me what did happen." "I don't owe you explanations." "Maybe not, but you owe her one." Wallace jerked his chin toward Clara. "Does she know what kind of man she married? Does she know what you're capable of when you lose your temper?" Cade's hands curled into fists at his sides, but his voice stayed level. "Last chance, Grady. Get on your horse and ride out, or I'll make you." "There it is. That violence you pretend isn't there." Wallace's eyes glittered with malice. "How long before you use it on her, I wonder? How long before—" He didn't get to finish. Cade moved faster than Clara had ever seen him move, closing the distance between them in 2 strides. But he didn't throw a punch. He just grabbed Wallace by the collar and walked him backward toward his horse with the inexorable force of an avalanche. "Get on," Cade said. Wallace tried to pull free. Couldn't. "Get your hands off me. Get on the horse." There was something in Cade's voice that made even Wallace pause. Some edge that suggested the violence he'd been taunting was closer to the surface than anyone wanted. Wallace got on his horse. "If I see you on my property again," Cade said quietly, "I won't be this polite. Understand?" Wallace jerked his reins, making the horse dance nervously. "You can't protect her forever, Mercer. Eventually she's going to see what you really are. And when that happens, leave." Wallace left, but the damage was done. Clara stood on the porch, arms wrapped around herself, watching Cade watch the rider disappear over the hill. When he finally turned back to face her, his expression was carefully blank. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Am I all right? Are you?" "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." Cade climbed the porch steps slowly, like he was giving her time to retreat if she wanted. "We should go inside." "Did you beat a man to death?" The question hung between them, sharp and unavoidable. Cade's jaw worked. "It's more complicated than that." "Then explain it to me." "I don't want to." "I don't care what you want," Clara said, harder than she meant. "I'm living in your house. I'm wearing your mother's clothes. I'm signing letters in your name. If there's something I need to know about who you are, tell me now." They stood there on the porch, wind cutting between them, neither willing to look away first. Finally, Cade sighed. "Inside. I'll tell you inside." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where they'd shared quiet meals and careful conversation for weeks. But now the space between them felt different, heavier. Cade stared at his hands for a long time before he spoke. "Jack Carson was a cattle rustler," he said finally. "Ran with a gang that worked the territory 6-7 years back. They'd steal livestock, sell them 2 counties over, move on before anyone could track them." He paused. "They hit my mother's ranch one night. She lived alone after my father died. Thought she could manage the property herself." Clara's chest tightened. She could already see where this was going. "I was working in Silver Creek at the time," Cade continued. "Didn't know anything was wrong until I came home 3 days later and found—" He stopped, started again. "They'd taken the cattle. And when my mother tried to stop them, they—" He didn't finish. Didn't need to. "I tracked them for 2 weeks," Cade said quietly. "Found their camp across the border. Found Jack Carson specifically, because he was the one who'd been bragging about it in saloons. About the woman who'd put up a fight." His hands curled into fists on the table. "I wasn't planning to kill him. I was planning to bring him back for trial. But when I confronted him, he laughed. Said she deserved what she got for being uppity." Clara could barely breathe. "So yeah," Cade said. "I beat him, and I didn't stop when I should have. By the time the sheriff pulled me off, Carson was dead." He looked up, met Clara's eyes. "The sheriff ruled it self-defense because Carson went for his gun first. That part's true. But the rest of it, the part where I kept hitting him even after he was down, that wasn't defense, that was rage." The silence stretched out, thick and suffocating. Why are you telling me this? Clara asked finally. Because you asked, and because you deserve to know what you're living with. You think I'm going to be scared of you now? Aren't you? Clara thought about it, really thought about it. A man who'd beaten someone to death, who carried that violence inside him like a loaded gun, who could lose control under. Also thought about the past month, about locked doors and choices freely given, about patience and distance, and the careful way Cade moved around her like she was something breakable that he refused to break. No, she said, I'm not scared. Cade looked stunned. You should be. Why? Because you loved your mother enough to lose control when someone hurt her? Clara leaned forward. That doesn't make you dangerous to me. That makes you human. Clara, everyone in this town acts like you're some kind of monster, but you know what I see? I see someone who spent 6 years punishing himself for one bad moment. Someone who's so terrified of hurting people that he lives alone in the mountains and won't even touch his own wife. That's not... Yes, it is. Clara's voice softened. You're not the monster they think you are, Cade. You're just a person who got broken and never let yourself heal. Cade stared at her like she'd spoken a language he didn't understand. Then he pushed back from the table and walked out. Clara let him go. She'd pushed enough for one day. That night Cade didn't come in for dinner. Clara ate alone, left his portion warming by the fire, and went upstairs feeling like she'd crossed some invisible line she couldn't uncross. She was reading in bed when she heard the front door open. Footsteps. The scrape of a chair. Quiet sounds of Cade eating the meal she'd left for him. Then his voice, barely loud enough to carry up the stairs. Thank you. Clara closed her eyes and didn't answer, but she smiled in the darkness of her locked room, and something that felt dangerously close to hope took root in her chest. The next morning, things shifted again. Cade was already up when Clara came downstairs, standing at the stove making breakfast. That alone was unusual. Normally he was out doing chores before she woke. I want to teach you to shoot, he said without preamble. Clara stopped halfway across the kitchen. What? A gun. I want to teach you how to use one. He didn't look at her, kept his attention on the eggs he was frying. Grady showing up yesterday. That's not going to be the last time, and I can't always be here. I don't need... Yes, you do. Now he did look at her. You were smart yesterday, standing up to him. But smart only gets you so far when a man's twice your size and 3 times as mean. You need to be able to protect yourself. Clara thought about arguing, about insisting she was fine, that nothing would happen, that Cade was overreacting. But that would be a lie, and they'd moved past comforting lies into harder truths. All right, she said, teach me. They spent that afternoon behind the barn, where a makeshift shooting range had been set up with targets nailed to hay bales. Cade started her on a rifle. Easier to handle than a pistol, he explained. More stable for beginners. Stand like this, he said, demonstrating. Feet shoulder width, rifle tight against your shoulder. If you hold it loose, the recoil will hurt. Clara copied his stance. The rifle was heavier than she'd expected, awkward in her hands. Cade moved closer, adjusting her grip. Firm but not tense, you're strangling it. I've never done this before. I know. That's why I'm teaching you. His hands covered hers, repositioning. Look down the sight. Line up the notch with the blade. See that? Clara tried to focus on the target, but she was hyper-aware of Cade standing behind her, his chest nearly touching her back, his hands warm over hers. This was the closest they'd been since the day they met, the most contact they'd had. I see it, she managed. Good. Now breathe, slow and steady. When you're ready, exhale halfway and squeeze the trigger. Don't pull, squeeze. Clara did as instructed. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder, the shot going wide and high, missing the target completely. Damn, she muttered. Again, Cade said. He'd stepped back, giving her space. And this time, don't flinch before you fire. It took 17 tries before Clara hit the target. When she finally did, Cade's quiet, good, felt better than any praise she'd ever received. They practiced until her shoulder ached and her ears rang, and she could hit the center target 3 times out of 5. Then Cade took the rifle, cleaned it while she watched, and showed her how to load it properly. Keep this in your room, he said, handing it back. Loaded. Safety on, but loaded. Cade, please. The word sounded foreign in his mouth. like he didn't use it often. I need to know you can defend yourself if something happens when I'm not here. So Clara took the rifle upstairs and leaned it against the wall beside her bed. That night she lay awake staring at it, this instrument of violence that was somehow also a gesture of care. The days began to blur together in a rhythm that felt almost normal. Clara managed the correspondence, helped with ranch work, practiced shooting every afternoon until she could hit targets Cade set up at increasingly difficult distances. They fell into an easy partnership that confused everyone who saw it. When they went to town for supplies 2 weeks later, the stares had changed. Less pity, more confusion. Clara walked beside Cade like an equal, spoke to shopkeepers directly, handled money openly. She'd stopped deferring, stopped apologizing for taking up space. Mrs. Patterson cornered her in the general store while Cade was loading feed sacks into the wagon. "You seem different," the older woman said, studying Clara with sharp eyes. "I'm not." "Yes, you are. Less frightened." "Maybe I was never as frightened as you thought," Mrs. Patterson hummed thoughtfully. "Or maybe you found something worth staying for." Clara didn't answer that. She just paid for the fabric she'd selected and walked out. But the words stuck with her. Worth staying for. Was that what this was? Had she stopped viewing the ranch as a refuge and started seeing it as home? That thought terrified her more than Wallace Grady's threats, because homes could be lost, could be taken away, could turn into prisons when you least expected it. The fear must have shown on her face during dinner that night, because Cade set down his fork and looked at her directly. "What's wrong?" "Nothing." "You're lying." Clara pushed food around her plate. "What happens if this doesn't work? This arrangement." "Then it doesn't work. And then what?" Cade was quiet for a moment. "Then I keep my promise. You leave with money and a horse and go wherever you want. Just like that? Just like that? You'd really let me go?" "Clara." He waited until she looked at him. "I'll always let you go. That's the whole point." "But what if I don't want to go?" Clara thought, but didn't say. What if that's what scares me most? Spring came slowly to the mountain valley, reluctant and cold. Snow melted in patches, revealing brown grass and mud. The creek swelled with runoff. Birds started appearing in numbers that suggested they'd been hiding all winter, waiting for permission to return. Clara watched the landscape transform and felt something similar happening inside herself. The sharp edges of survival instinct were smoothing out. The constant vigilance was easing. She caught herself laughing at something Cade said about a stubborn cow, then stopped, startled by the unfamiliar sound. When had she become someone who laughed? They were fixing fence line one afternoon in late March when Cade brought up the topic Clara had been carefully avoiding. "The spring dance is next month," he said, hammering a post into place. Clara handed him another nail. So? "So the whole town goes. It's expected. We went to church. Once. That was enough." "I know, but this is different. This is..." Cade paused, considering. "This is where people see who you really are. Not just the girl who married me out of desperation, but who you've become since." "I haven't become anything." "Yes, you have." He looked at her directly. "You've become someone who negotiates cattle prices and shoots straight and doesn't back down from men twice her size. The town should see that." "Why do you care what the town sees?" "I don't, but you might, someday." Cade went back to hammering. "And I'd rather them know the truth than keep believing whatever story they've made up." Clara thought about it while they worked. About Sarah Bellamy's pitying looks. About Martha Hayes' gentle condescension. About an entire town that had decided she was a victim who needed saving. "All right," she said finally. "We'll go, but I'm not dancing." "That's fine. And if anyone says anything, you'll handle it however you want. I'm not going to stop you." The spring dance was held in the town hall the first Saturday of April. By the time Clara and Cade arrived, the place was already packed with people dressed in their best clothes, music playing, couples spinning across the floor. The moment they walked in, conversation stopped. Clara wore a dress she'd made herself, dark green fabric with simple lines, nothing fancy but well constructed. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She looked older than 16, looked like someone who'd earned her place in the world rather than been given it. Cade stayed close but not possessive, one hand resting lightly on the small of her back as they navigated through the crowd. Clara could feel eyes tracking their movement, could hear whispers starting up again in their wake. Then Sarah Bellamy appeared in front of them, blocking their path. "Clara," she said, voice dripping with false sweetness. "How brave of you to come." "Sarah." Clara kept her tone neutral. "And Cade. Such a devoted husband, bringing you to a dance." Sarah's smile sharpened. "Though I suppose she's too young to actually dance with you. That would look inappropriate." Several people nearby laughed. It wasn't kind laughter. Cade's hand tightened slightly on Clara's back, but he said nothing. He'd meant what he said. This was hers to handle. Clara stepped forward, putting herself between Cade and Sarah. "You're right," she said clearly. "I probably am too young for a lot of things. Too young to be married, too young to run a ranch, too young to negotiate business deals or handle finances." She paused. "But apparently I'm not too young to do all of those things anyway. While you're still living in your father's house, waiting for someone to notice you exist." Sarah's face flushed red. "How dare!" "I dare just fine." Clara's voice didn't rise, but it cut through the noise around them. "You want to know if I'm happy? If I'm safe? Here's the truth. I'm freer now than I've ever been in my life. I make choices. I have options. I have a future that isn't just survival." She glanced around at the watching crowd. "That's more than most women in this town can say." The silence was absolute. Then someone started clapping. Slow at first, then louder. Clara looked over to see an old woman she didn't recognize, gnarled hands coming together with steady rhythm. "Well said, girl," the woman called out. "Well said indeed." A few other people joined the applause. Not many, but enough. Sarah backed away, humiliated, disappearing into the crowd. Cade leaned down to Clara's ear. "You all right?" "Better than all right," Clara said. And she meant it. The rest of the dance passed without incident. Clara didn't dance, she'd meant that too, but she stood beside Cade and watched, and for the first time she didn't feel like the town's cautionary tale. She felt like someone who'd made her own choices and survived them. On the ride home, the stars were out in full force, painting the sky with light that seemed impossible. "You surprised me tonight," Cade said into the quiet. "How?" "I expected you to let the comments slide, keep the peace." "I'm tired of keeping the peace." Clara looked over at him. "I'm tired of making myself smaller so other people feel comfortable." "Good." The corner of Cade's mouth lifted. "Don't stop." When they got back to the ranch, Clara didn't go straight upstairs like usual. Instead, she stayed in the kitchen while Cade banked the fire, neither of them ready to end the night. "Thank you," Clara said finally, "for letting me handle that myself. You didn't need my permission." "I know. But you could have stepped in anyway. Most men would have." "I'm not most men." "No," Clara agreed quietly. "You're really not." They stood there in the firelight, the space between them charged with something neither was quite ready to name. Then Cade cleared his throat and took a deliberate step back. "You should get some rest," he said. "It's late." Clara nodded and went upstairs, but she left her door unlocked that night. A small gesture, probably meaningless. But it felt like progress anyway. The unlocked door became a pattern neither of them acknowledged out loud. Clara still locked it some nights, when old fears crept back in, when the weight of vulnerability felt too heavy. But more often than not, she left it open. A silent statement that she trusted the man sleeping downstairs more than she feared what might happen if she didn't. Cade never mentioned it, never tested it. But Clara noticed he stopped moving around as quietly at night, like he wanted her to know where he was. Footsteps on the stairs became deliberate. The sound of him banking the fire carried up through the floorboards. Small reassurances that he was there, that everything was normal, that she was safe. April brought warmer weather and harder work. Calving season hit the ranch like a storm, and suddenly there weren't enough hours in the day. Clara learned to recognize the signs of a cow in labor, learned which complications she could handle and which ones required Cade immediately. She spent nights in the barn, covered in blood and birth fluid, helping new life struggle into a world that didn't care if it survived or not. "Pull steady," Cade said one night, both of them working to deliver a calf that was stuck wrong. "Don't yank, steady pressure." Clara gritted her teeth and pulled. The calf came free in a rush of fluid, landing in the hay motionless and slick. Her heart dropped. "It's not breathing. Clear the airway." Cade was already moving, hands working fast. "Come on, work with me. Together they cleared the calf's nose and mouth, stimulated its chest. For long seconds, nothing happened. Then the calf gasped, coughed, and started breathing in shaky, uneven pulls of air. Clara sat back in the hay, exhausted and relieved and covered in things she didn't want to think about. "That was too close," she said. "They're all too close." Cade checked the mother cow, who was already trying to stand. "But you did good. Stayed calm." "I didn't feel calm. Doesn't matter what you feel. Matters what you do." He stood, offered her a hand up. "Come on, let's get cleaned up." They walked back to the house in the pre-dawn gray, both too tired to talk. Clara's hands were shaking from adrenaline crash and her clothes were ruined beyond saving. "There's hot water on the stove," Cade said when they got inside. "You go first." Clara was too exhausted to argue. She heated water, carried it upstairs, and washed away the evidence of the night in a basin that turned pink, then red, then brown. When she came back down in clean clothes, Cade had coffee waiting and bread sliced on the table. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." "I will, after I check the other pastures." "Cade, you've been up for 24 hours. So have you. I'm younger. I recover faster." Clara pushed a coffee cup toward him. "Sit down for 5 minutes. The cows can wait." He sat. Not because she told him to, but because he was too tired to argue. They drank coffee in silence while dawn light crept through the windows, painting everything gold and forgiving. Clara studied Cade's face, the lines around his eyes deeper than usual, exhaustion making him look older than whatever age he actually was. She realized she didn't know how old he was, had never asked. "How old are you?" The question came out before she could stop it. Cade looked up, surprised. 32. "That's not twice my age." "Close enough that people talk." "People talk anyway." Clara wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "Does it bother you, the age difference?" "Sometimes." He was quiet for a moment. "Mostly it bothers me that you're 16 and you've already had to make choices most people don't face until they're twice that." "I didn't have much choice in those choices." "I know. That's what bothers me." Clara thought about that. About being 16 and married and learning to deliver calves at 3 in the morning. About writing business letters and shooting rifles and standing up to men who wanted to diminish her. None of it felt like childhood. All of it felt like survival. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "Buying Frank's debt? Marrying me?" Cade's answer came without hesitation. "No." "Why not?" "Because the alternative was worse. For you, I mean. I don't know if this is good, but I know what Grady would have done was worse." He set down his cup. "That's enough reason." "That's a low bar." "Maybe, but we cleared it." Clara smiled despite herself. "Yeah, I guess we did." The next week brought trouble in a different form. Clara was in town alone. Cade had stayed back to deal with a broken fence when she ran into Wallace Grady outside the general store. He was leaning against the hitching post like he'd been waiting, and the smile he gave her made her skin crawl. "Well now," he said, "look who's all alone. Where's your watchdog?" Clara kept her expression neutral. "None of your business." "Everything about you is my business, sweetheart. You were supposed to be mine, remember?" "I was never going to be yours. Your uncle seemed to think different." Wallace pushed off the post, moving closer. $300 I offered him. Would have paid more if I'd known you'd turn into something interesting. Claire's hand moved to the knife she'd started carrying in her boot, a precaution Cade had insisted on after his last visit to the ranch. "Stay back." "Or what? You'll scream?" "Go ahead. Nobody in this town's going to help you." He took another step. "They all think you're where you deserve to be anyway. Mercer's little pet project." "I'm nobody's pet." "Could have fooled me. I've seen the way you follow him around, the way you look at him." Wallace's voice dropped lower, meaner. "Does he touch you, Clara? Or is he too much of a coward for that too?" The question hit something raw in Clara's chest, not because it was true, but because it scraped against uncertainties she hadn't wanted to examine. "That's none of your concern," she said, voice tight. "I'm making it my concern. Because when he gets tired of playing house with a child, and he will, I'll still be here. And I'll still want what I paid for." "You didn't pay for anything, didn't I?" Wallace smiled. "Your uncle still owes me money, you know. Different money, different debt. And I'm a patient man when it comes to collecting. Before Clara could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "There's a problem here." Sheriff Tom Mitchell stood in the doorway of his office across the street, hand resting casual on his gun belt. He was an older man, gray-haired and weathered, but his eyes were sharp. Wallace stepped back immediately, hands up in mock surrender. "No problem, Sheriff. Just having a conversation with Mrs. Mercer," Mitchell asked. "Just a conversation?" Clara wanted to say no. Wanted to tell the sheriff exactly what Wallace had said and what he'd implied. But she'd learned enough about small-town politics to know it wouldn't help. Wallace had money and influence. She had Cade's protection and nothing else. "Just a conversation," she said. Mitchell's eyes said he didn't believe her, but he nodded anyway. "Well then, I'm sure you've got shopping to finish, Clara. And Wallace, I'm sure you've got somewhere else to be." It wasn't a suggestion. Wallace tipped his hat, that same ugly smile still on his face. "See you around, Mrs. Mercer." He walked away. Mitchell waited until he was gone, then crossed the street to where Clara stood. "You all right?" he asked quietly. "I'm fine." "He threatens you again, you tell Cade, or you tell me. Understand?" Clara nodded, not trusting her voice. Mitchell studied her for a moment. "You're handling yourself better than most expected. Just be careful. Men like Grady don't forget when they lose something they wanted. I was never his to lose. I know that. Make sure he knows that too." When Clara got back to the ranch, Cade took one look at her face and set down the tools he'd been working with. "What happened?" Clara told him. All of it. Wallace's threats, the sheriff's intervention, the implication that somehow Clara belonged to whoever paid the right price. By the time she finished, Cade's expression had gone cold and dangerous. "I'm going into town," he said. "No, you're not." "Clara, no." She stepped in front of him. "That's exactly what he wants. He wants you to lose control. To do something that makes you look like the violent man everyone thinks you are." "I don't care what people think." "Maybe not, but I do. Because when you're not there, I have to deal with those people. And I'd rather they not have confirmation that my husband is one bad day away from killing someone else." Cade flinched like she'd slapped him. Clara immediately regretted the words. "I didn't mean—" "Yes, you did. And you're right." He took a breath, visibly forcing himself to calm down. "What do you want me to do?" "Nothing. For now, just let it go. And when he comes back, because he will come back, then we deal with it together." Clara met his eyes. "But we don't give him what he wants. We don't give him the satisfaction of seeing us break." Cade was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded, stiff and reluctant. "All right, we do it your way." But the encounter with Wallace changed something between them, made the threats more real, the danger less theoretical. That night at dinner, Cade was quieter than usual, withdrawn into whatever dark thoughts he was having. "Talk to me," Clara said finally. "About what?" "About whatever's going on in your head that's making you look like that." Cade set down his fork. "I'm thinking about how much I want to hurt him, and how easy it would be, and how that makes me exactly what everyone thinks I am. It doesn't—" "Yes, it does." His voice was flat. "I killed a man, Clara. Beat him to death with my hands. That's not something normal people do. That's not something you just move past. You had a reason. Having a reason doesn't make it right." He looked at her directly. "Sometimes I wonder if everyone else is right about me. If I am dangerous. If it's just a matter of time before you what? Hurt me?" Clara's voice hardened. "Is that what you think? That you're going to lose control and hurt me?" "I don't know. I do." Clara stood up, walked around the table until she was standing right in front of him. "You're not going to hurt me. You know how I know? Because you've had 100 opportunities and you haven't taken any of them. Because you sleep downstairs in a house where you could go anywhere. Because you gave me a gun and taught me how to use it on you if I needed to." "Clara, you're not the monster, Cade. You're the man who's so afraid of being a monster that you won't even let yourself be human." She reached out, hesitated, then put her hand on his shoulder. First time she'd touched him deliberately, without a reason. "That's not the same thing." Cade looked at her hand on his shoulder like he didn't know what to do with it, like he was afraid to move in case she pulled away. "I don't know how to be different than this," he said quietly. "Maybe you don't need to be." They stayed like that for a moment. Clara's hand on Cade's shoulder, both of them carefully not acknowledging what the gesture meant. Then Clara pulled back, and Cade let her go, and they finished dinner in silence that felt less heavy than before. That night, Clara left her door open again, and sometime in the dark hours before dawn, she heard Cade's footsteps pause at the bottom of the stairs, staying there for a long moment before moving away. Small steps. Careful progress. But progress nonetheless. The next 2 weeks passed in tense anticipation of trouble that didn't come. Wallace stayed away from the ranch, stayed out of town when Clara was there. It should have been a relief. Instead, it felt like waiting for the other shoe to drop. Then the annual Copper Hollow Fair arrived, and with it the confrontation Clara had been dreading. The fair was the biggest event of the spring season. Livestock competitions, shooting contests, food vendors, music. The entire territory showed up, which meant avoiding it would have been obvious and cowardly. So Clara put on her best dress, checked that her knife was secure in her boot, and rode into town beside Cade with her chin up and her stomach churning. The fairgrounds were packed. Families everywhere, children running wild. The smell of roasting meat and fresh bread mixing with dust and horse sweat. Clara stuck close to Cade as they navigated through the crowd, hyper-aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. "You want to look at anything?" Cade asked. "Not particularly. We can leave." "No." Clara straightened her shoulders. "I'm not running." They made it almost an hour before Wallace Grady found them. He was drunk. Not falling down drunk, but enough that his inhibitions were gone and his mean streak was showing. He cornered them near the livestock pens, surrounded by enough people that whatever happened next would have an audience. "Mercer," Wallace said loudly, "and the little wife. How domestic." Cade's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. "Tell me something," Wallace continued, voice carrying across the crowd. "How's it feel being married to a man who's too scared to touch you? Must be frustrating for a young thing like you." The crowd went quiet, waiting. Clara felt Cade tense beside her, felt the violence coiling in him like a spring. She put a hand on his arm. "Let me," she said quietly. Then she turned to face Wallace with a smile that was all edges. "You seem awfully interested in my marriage for someone who's not part of it," she said clearly. "Makes a person wonder what you're compensating for." A few people in the crowd laughed. Wallace's face darkened. "Careful, girl. You don't know who you're talking to." "I know exactly who I'm talking to. A man who's so pathetic he measures his worth by what he can buy, including people." Clara took a step forward. "But here's the thing, Wallace. You can't buy me. You never could, because I was never for sale." "Your uncle seemed to think different. My uncle was a drunk and a fool, and you were the bigger fool for believing him." Clara's voice didn't rise, but it cut through the murmuring crowd like a blade. "You want to know the truth? You want to know why I'm with Cade instead of you?" "Clara." Cade's warning tone. She ignored him. "It's because he treats me like a person, like someone with thoughts and choices and a future that belongs to me. Not like property to be owned, not like a prize to be won." She looked Wallace up and down with visible contempt. "You could have all the money in the territory and you still wouldn't be half the man he is." The silence was absolute. Wallace's face went red, then white. His hand moved toward his gun belt. And Cade was there, faster than Clara had ever seen him move, his hand clamping down on Wallace's wrist like iron. "Don't," Cade said quietly. "You really don't want to do that. Get your hands off me. Walk away, Grady, right now, while you still can." For a long moment they stood there, locked together, the whole fair holding its breath. Then Sheriff Mitchell pushed through the crowd, hand on his own gun. "Problem here, gentlemen?" "No problem," Cade said, not taking his eyes off Wallace. "Mr. Grady was just leaving." Wallace jerked his hand free, breathing hard. He looked at Clara with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he said. "Yes, it is," Clara said. "You just don't know it yet." Wallace left. The crowd began to disperse, conversations starting up again in hushed, excited tones. Mitchell looked between Cade and Clara with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. "You two know how to make an entrance," he said finally. "Wasn't our choice," Cade said. "Never is." Mitchell tipped his hat. "Clara, that was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've seen in a long time. Can't quite decide which." "Can it be both?" Clara asked. Mitchell almost smiled. "I suppose it can." He looked at Cade. You might want to get her home before Grady gets more liquor in him and decides to be really stupid." They left the fair without another word, Claire's heart still pounding from adrenaline and anger. When they were on the road back to the ranch, Cade finally spoke. "That was reckless." "I know. He could have shot you. But he didn't." "Clara." "I'm tired of being afraid of him." Clara looked over at Cade. "I'm tired of giving him power over my life just by existing. So I took it back. Maybe that was stupid, but it felt necessary." Cade was quiet for a long moment. Then, "It was brave and stupid, both at once. That seems to be my specialty." "Yeah." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly. "It is." They rode the rest of the way home in silence, but it was the comfortable kind. The kind that came from understanding each other without needing words. When they got back, Claire went straight to the barn to check on the animals, needing something normal and routine to settle her nerves. Cade followed, maintaining a careful distance while she worked. "I meant what I said," Clara said without looking at him. "About you being twice the man he is." "I know. Do you believe it?" "I'm trying to." Clara turned to face him. "What would it take? For you to believe it?" Cade leaned against a stall door, looking tired and uncertain in a way that made him seem more human than the stone-faced rancher everyone else saw. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've spent 6 years convinced I'm one mistake away from becoming something I can't come back from. That's not an easy thing to unlearn." "But you want to try?" "I want—" He stopped, started again. "I want to be the person you seem to think I am." Claire's chest felt tight. "You already are. You don't know that." "Yes, I do. Because I've seen you at your worst. I've seen you angry and scared and holding yourself back from violence. And you know what? You still chose control. Every single time." She took a step closer. "That's not who you are despite yourself, Cade. That's just who you are." Cade looked at her like she'd handed him something precious and breakable that he didn't know how to hold. "I don't deserve you," he said quietly. "Good thing deserving isn't required." Clara smiled slightly. "Besides, I'm not exactly a prize. I'm stubborn and reckless, and I don't know when to keep my mouth shut. Those are features, not flaws. Tell that to everyone who thinks I should be more grateful and less mouthy. They're wrong." "I know." Clara finished with the horses, wiped her hands on her skirt. "Come on, let's go inside. I'm starving, and you look like you could use a drink." They walked back to the house together, the evening air cool against Clara's skin. Inside, Cade poured whiskey for both of them, a first, treating her like an adult who could handle it, and they sat at the table in the fading light. "To reckless stupidity," Clara said, raising her glass. "To surviving it," Cade corrected, and they drank. The whiskey burned going down, but it loosened something in Clara's chest that had been tight since the confrontation. She poured them both another round. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always." "Do you ever regret it, not marrying me specifically, but choosing this life? Living alone out here, being the person everyone's afraid of?" Cade turned his glass in his hands, thinking. "Sometimes. Mostly I regret what led to it. The things I can't change." "Your mother?" "Yeah, and everything after." He took a drink. "But choosing this life, living alone? That part I don't regret. It was necessary." "Was?" He looked at her. "Things change." The weight of that statement hung between them, heavy with implications neither was quite ready to voice. "Things do change," Clara agreed quietly. They finished their drinks in comfortable silence. When Clara finally went upstairs, she paused at her bedroom door and looked back. Cade was still sitting at the table, staring into his empty glass like it held answers to questions he hadn't asked. Clara wanted to say something, wanted to bridge the gap that was narrowing between them with every passing day. But she didn't know what words would fit the moment without breaking it. So she just said goodnight and closed her door, left it unlocked. Hoped that small gesture said what she couldn't put into words. Downstairs, Cade sat alone in the dark and tried to figure out when exactly his carefully controlled life had stopped being about protection and started being about loneliness. And what the hell he was supposed to do about the 16-year-old girl upstairs who was slowly dismantling every wall he'd built around himself. He didn't have answers. But for the first time in 6 years, he wanted to find them. The morning after the fair, Clara woke to the sound of hammering. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find Cade's coffee cup empty on the table, the fire already going strong. Through the kitchen window, she could see him working on something near the barn. New fence posts, maybe, or repairs to the corral gate that had been sagging for weeks. But when she got closer, she realized he was building something new entirely. A small structure, maybe 8 feet by 10, framed out in rough lumber. "What's this?" she called out. Cade looked up, hammer in hand. "Workshop. Figured you might want a space of your own, for sewing, or whatever else you want to do with it." Clara stopped walking. "You're building me a workshop? If you want it. If not, I'll use it for tools." He went back to hammering, like he hadn't just casually offered her something nobody had ever given her before. Space that was hers and hers alone. "I want it," Clara said quietly. Cade nodded, driving another nail home. "Good. Should be done in a few days." Clara watched him work for a moment, this man who communicated through actions instead of words, who built things with his hands because saying what he meant out loud was apparently impossible. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet. Might fall apart first strong wind." "It won't. You don't know that." "Yes, I do." Clara picked up a board he'd cut and set it aside. "Because you built it." Cade paused mid-swing, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Then he went back to hammering, but Clara caught the slight color on his neck that might have been embarrassment or pleasure or both. She spent the morning helping him, holding boards steady, handing him nails, learning the rhythm of construction work. It was companionable in a way that made Clara's chest ache with something she still wasn't ready to name. By afternoon, the frame was complete, and they were taking a break in the shade when a rider appeared on the eastern road. Cade stood immediately, hand moving to the rifle he'd leaned against the fence. But Clara recognized the horse before he did. "It's Sheriff Mitchell," she said. Mitchell rode into the yard looking grim. He dismounted slowly, like a man carrying bad news. "Tom?" Cade said by way of greeting. "Something wrong?" "Depends on how you look at it." Mitchell pulled an envelope from his coat pocket. "Got served with papers this morning. Thought I should bring them out personally rather than let the official courier handle it." Cade took the envelope, face carefully blank. "What kind of papers?" "Legal petition. Wallace Grady's claiming your marriage to Clara is invalid. Says her uncle didn't have the legal right to consent on her behalf, and he's asking the court to dissolve the union and award him guardianship rights based on his prior financial agreement with Frank Whitmore." The words hung in the air like poison. Clara felt the ground shift under her feet. "He can't do that." "He can try," Mitchell said. "Whether he'll succeed is another question, but he's got lawyers from Silver Creek involved, and they're making noise about impropriety and coercion and a whole mess of legal angles I don't fully understand." Cade was reading the papers, his expression getting darker with each line. "This says there's a hearing in 2 weeks. "Yeah, in front of Judge Harrison. You'll both need to be there." Mitchell looked at Clara. "You'll probably be questioned separately about the circumstances of the marriage, your living situation, whether you're there of your own free will." Clara's hands curled into fists. "This is because of what I said at the fair, because I embarrassed him." "Probably didn't help," Mitchell admitted. "But Grady's been planning something like this since the day you married Mercer. This just gave him an excuse to act." "Can he actually win?" Clara asked. "Can the court just give me to him?" "The law's complicated when it comes to marriages involving minors." Mitchell shifted his weight. "Technically, if the judge rules the marriage invalid, you'd become a ward of the court until you turn 18. And if Grady can prove he has a legitimate claim based on his agreement with your uncle, then I'm right back where I started," Clara finished. "Except worse, because now everyone knows I tried to get away." The silence that followed was heavy with implications nobody wanted to voice. Cade folded the papers carefully, deliberately. "Is there anything we can do? Legally?" "Get a lawyer. A good one. Someone who knows family law and isn't scared of Grady's money." Mitchell paused. "There's a woman in Silver Creek, Catherine Brennan. She's handled cases like this before. Expensive, but worth it if you can afford her." "I can afford her," Cade said flatly. "Then I'd ride out there soon. You've only got 2 weeks to build a case." Mitchell looked between them. "I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you need right now." After Mitchell left, Clara and Cade stood in the yard not looking at each other, both processing what had just happened. This is my fault, Clara said finally. I pushed him too far. No. Cade's voice was hard. This is Grady being exactly who he's always been. You just refuse to pretend otherwise. But if I'd kept quiet, then he would have found another excuse. Cade turned to face her. You think staying silent and small would have protected you? It wouldn't have. Men like Grady don't stop because you cooperate. They stop when they're forced to. Clara wanted to argue, but she knew he was right. So what do? We fight. Cade's jaw set in that stubborn line she'd come to recognize. We get the lawyer, we build the case, and we make damn sure the judge understands you're not going anywhere. You don't choose to go. And if we lose? Cade was quiet for a long moment. Then we deal with that when it happens. But we don't lose because we didn't try. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through scenarios in her head. A courtroom full of men deciding her future. Questions about her marriage, her living arrangements, whether she'd been coerced or manipulated. The possibility of being handed over to Wallace Grady like a piece of disputed property. Around midnight, she heard Cade moving around downstairs, pacing from the sound of it. She got up, pulled a shawl around her shoulders, and went down. He was at the kitchen table, papers spread out in front of him, a half-empty whiskey bottle beside his elbow. He looked up when she appeared. Can't sleep? He asked. Can you? No. He gestured to the papers. Trying to figure out what we can use, what arguments we can make. Clara sat down across from him. What have you got? Not much. The marriage license is legal enough, but Grady's lawyers are claiming coercion and improper consent. They're arguing Frank had no right to sign as your guardian since he wasn't appointed by any court. Cade ran a hand through his hair. The problem is, they're technically right. So what's our defense? That you stayed of your own free will. That you've had opportunities to leave and haven't taken them. That this is a legitimate marriage based on mutual agreement, regardless of how it started. He looked at her directly. But that requires you to testify that you want to stay married to me, in front of a judge and half the town. Can you do that? Clara's throat felt tight. Is that what you want? For me to stay married to you? That's not what I'm asking. I know, I'm asking anyway. Cade was quiet for so long, Clara thought he might not answer. Then, I want you to be safe. I want you to have choices. If staying married to me is what accomplishes that, then yes. If not, he didn't finish the sentence. What if I want to stay? Clara's voice came out smaller than she intended. What if I choose this? Not because it's safer than Grady, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I actually want to be here? Cade looked at her like she'd spoken in a language he was still learning to understand. Then I'd say you should think about that carefully before you say it in court. Because once you do, it's on record. It's real. It already feels real. Clara, I'm not a child, Cade. Stop treating me like I don't know my own mind. She leaned forward. I know this started as a rescue. I know you married me to keep me away from Grady, not because you wanted a wife. But things change. People change. And I'm telling you now, I want to stay. The words hung in the air between them, impossible to take back. Cade's hands tightened on the table edge. You're 16 years old. You don't know what you want. I know I don't want to be handed over to a man who sees me as property. I know I don't want to leave the first place I've ever felt safe. And I know... She stopped, gathered courage. I know I'd rather take my chances with you than with anyone else in this territory. That's not the same as wanting to be married to me. Maybe not, but it's a start. Cade stood abruptly, pacing to the window and back. This is exactly what they'll use against us. They'll say I manipulated you, isolated you, made you dependent. Let them say it. I know the truth. Do you? He turned to face her. Because from where I'm standing, I'm a 32-year-old man who took advantage of a desperate situation to acquire a teenage wife. That's what it looks like, Clara. That's what everyone's going to see. I don't care what everyone sees. I care what's true. And what is true? Clara stood up, closing the distance between them. The truth is, you gave me choices when nobody else would. You taught me to protect myself instead of making me helpless. You built me a workshop because you thought I might want one. That's not manipulation, Cade. That's... She stopped, not quite ready to finish that thought. That's what... His voice was rough. That's what people who care about each other do. The silence that followed felt charged, dangerous. They stood close enough that Clara could see the conflict in Cade's eyes, the war between what he wanted and what he thought was right. "I'm trying to do the right thing here," he said quietly. "I know, but maybe the right thing isn't pushing me away. Maybe it's trusting me to know what I want." "And what do you want?" Clara took a breath. "I want to fight this petition. I want to stand in front of that judge and tell him I'm staying married to you by choice. And then I want to come back here and keep building whatever this is." She gestured between them. "Even if I don't fully understand it yet." Cade looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, something settling in his expression. "All right, then that's what we'll do." They rode to Silver Creek 2 days later to meet with Catherine Brennan. The lawyer's office was above a dressmaker's shop, accessed by a narrow staircase that creaked with every step. Inside, Catherine Brennan turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s, with graying hair pulled back severely and the kind of expression that suggested she didn't suffer fools. "Mr. Mercer, Mrs. Mercer." She gestured to chairs across from her desk. "Sheriff Mitchell sent word you'd be coming. I've reviewed the petition Grady filed." "And?" Cade asked. "And it's a mess legally, but that doesn't mean it's not dangerous." Catherine steepled her fingers. "The core argument is that your uncle had no legal authority to consent to your marriage, which makes the marriage voidable. Add in the age difference, the financial transaction involved, and Grady's claim of a prior agreement, and you've got a case that could go either way depending on the judge's mood." "What do we need to prove?" Clara asked. "That the marriage is legitimate regardless of how it started, that you're staying of your own free will, that you understand your options, and are choosing this one." Catherine looked at Clara directly. "The judge will question you separately. He'll ask if you've been threatened, coerced, manipulated. He'll want to know if you understand you could leave and be placed with a different guardian." "I understand all of that." "Good, because you'll need to say it clearly and convincingly. Any hesitation, any sign that you're scared or uncertain, and Grady's lawyers will use it." Catherine turned to Cade. "And you'll need to demonstrate that you're a suitable guardian and husband despite the circumstances. That means character witnesses, financial records, proof that you're providing appropriate care." "I can get those things," Cade said. "Do it quickly. We've got less than 2 weeks." Catherine pulled out paper and pen. "Now let's go through exactly what happened from the beginning. And I mean everything. How you met, why you married, what your living arrangement is like. I need to know what they're going to dig up before they dig it up." The next hour was brutal. Catherine's questions were precise and unforgiving, forcing them to articulate things they'd never spoken out loud. The sleeping arrangements, the financial arrangement, the exact nature of their relationship. "So you've never consummated the marriage," Catherine said, making a note. Clara felt heat flood her face. "No, that actually helps us. Proves you're not being used for, well," Catherine waved a hand. "But it also raises questions about whether this is a legitimate marriage or just a legal arrangement." "It's legitimate," Clara said firmly. "Can you explain how?" Clara looked at Cade, who was staring at the floor like he wanted it to open up and swallow him. "We're partners. We run the ranch together, make decisions together. We trust each other." "That's good. Hold on to that phrasing." Catherine made another note. "Judge Harrison is old-fashioned but fair. He won't like that you're 16, but he also won't like the idea of handing you over to a man with Wallace Grady's reputation. We need to make him see that staying with Mercer is the lesser of two evils. No offense, Mr. Mercer." "None taken. Better yet, we make him see it's not about evils at all. It's about a young woman making an informed choice about her own future." Catherine set down her pen. "That's going to be our angle. Choice, agency, self-determination. You're not a victim being rescued, Mrs. Mercer. You're a person exercising your right to choose your own life." Clara nodded, feeling steadier. "I can do that." "I hope so. Because if you can't convince Harrison, he'll dissolve the marriage and put you in state custody until a new guardian is appointed. And I guarantee Grady will position himself as the obvious candidate." They left Silver Creek with a strategy and a knot of anxiety in both their stomachs. On the ride home, Cade was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "You can still change your mind. If this is too much, if you don't want to go through with it, I'm not changing my mind. Clara, this is going to get ugly. They're going to say terrible things about both of us, about you specifically." Let them. You say that now, Shits. I say that because I mean it. Clara looked over at him. I'm done being ashamed of surviving. If the price of keeping my freedom is standing in a courtroom and telling the truth, then that's what I'll do. Cade's hands tightened on the reins. I wish I could make this easier. You can't? But you can stop apologizing for it. Clara shifted in her seat. Your fault, Cade. Grady was always going to come after me. All you did was give me a fighting chance. Not much of one. It's more than I had before. They rode the rest of the way in silence, but Clara noticed Cade's posture had straightened slightly, like her words had lifted some weight he'd been carrying. The next 10 days were a blur of preparation. Catherine Brennan visited the ranch, interviewed their neighbors, collected affidavits from people who'd seen Clara and Cade together. Sheriff Mitchell testified that he'd never witnessed any signs of coercion or abuse. Even Mrs. Patterson from the general store, surprisingly, provided a statement saying Clara seemed happier and healthier than she'd ever been under Frank's care. But the most important preparation was the conversation Clara and Cade had 3 nights before the hearing. They were in the barn, checking on a mare who was due to foal any day, when Cade said, "There's something I need to give you." He pulled an envelope from his coat pocket. Inside were legal documents. Clara recognized the format from the marriage papers. What is this? Annulment papers. Cade's voice was carefully neutral. Pre-signed by me. If the hearing goes badly, if you need an out, these will dissolve the marriage immediately. Catherine knows about them. She can file them at any time. Clara stared at the papers like they were a snake. You want to annul the marriage? No, but I want you to have the option. I don't want the option. Take them anyway. He pressed the envelope into her hands. Please. I need to know you can leave if you need to, that you're not trapped. Clara looked down at the envelope, then up at Cade's face. He looked scared in a way she'd never seen before, not of violence or danger, but of something internal and unnamed. You're terrified I'm going to leave, she said quietly. Aren't you? Cade didn't answer, which was answer enough. Clara took the envelope, walked to the fireplace that heated the barn workshop, and threw the papers directly into the flames. They caught immediately, curling and blackening and turning to ash. What are you doing? Cade's voice was strangled. Making a choice. Clara watched the papers burn. You keep giving me ways out. Locked doors, money, horses. Now annulment papers. But I don't want an exit strategy, Cade. I want to stay. You don't know what you're saying. Yes, I do. She turned to face him. I'm saying I trust you. I'm saying this place feels like home. I'm saying whatever we're building here, I want to keep building it. She paused. I'm saying I care about you, and I think you care about me, and maybe that's enough to start with. Cade looked at her like she'd punched him. Clara, I know it's complicated. I know I'm too young and you're too damaged, and this whole situation is a disaster legally and morally, and probably a dozen other ways. But I also know I'm happier here than I've ever been anywhere. She took a step closer. So stop trying to make me leave. Please. For a long moment, Cade just stared at the ashes in the fireplace where the annulment papers had been. Then he looked at Clara, really looked at her, and something in his expression shifted. You're impossible, he said quietly. I know. And reckless. That too. And you're going to stand in front of a judge in 3 days and say, you want to stay married to me. Yes. Even though I'm a mess. Even though I don't know how to be what you need. You're already what I need, Clara said. You just don't realize it yet. Cade crossed the space between them in 2 strides and pulled her into a hug, sudden and tight and desperate. Clara froze for half a second, then wrapped her arms around him and held on. They stood like that in the barn, surrounded by hay and horses and the smell of wood smoke, holding on to each other like they were the only solid things in a world that wouldn't stop shifting. I don't know how to do this, Cade said into her hair. Neither do I. But you want to try? Yeah. Clara's voice was muffled against his chest. I really do. Cade pulled back just enough to look at her face. His hand came up to cup her cheek, rough and gentle at once. For a moment, Clara thought he might kiss her. Instead, he pressed his forehead against hers and just breathed. We're going to win this, he said quietly. Whatever it takes. We're going to win. Clara believed him. The night before the hearing, Clara couldn't eat. She sat at the dinner table pushing food around her plate while Cade did the same across from her. "We should sleep," he said finally. "Tomorrow's going to be long." Clara nodded but didn't move. "What if it's not enough? What if the judge doesn't believe us? Then we deal with it." "How?" Cade was quiet for a moment. "Honestly, I don't know. But I know I'm not letting Grady take you without a fight." "A legal fight," Clara clarified. "Not an actual fight." "Sure. Legal." The way he said it suggested he had backup plans Catherine Brennan wouldn't approve of. Clara almost smiled. "You can't kill a judge, Cade." "Wasn't planning to kill the judge." "Grady, then." "Also not planning that. Mostly." He pushed back from the table. "Come on. Let's at least pretend to sleep." Clara went upstairs but lay awake for hours, running through potential questions and answers in her head. Around 2 a.m, she heard Cade's door open, heard him moving through the house. She got up and found him standing in the kitchen staring out the window at nothing. "Can't sleep either?" she asked. He turned. "Didn't want to wake you." "You didn't." Clara wrapped her shawl tighter. "What are you thinking about?" "Everything that could go wrong tomorrow." "That's a long list." "Yeah." He rubbed his face. "I keep thinking about what Grady's lawyers are going to say, about what the town will say, about how none of this would be happening if I'd just left you alone." "Don't do that." "Do what?" "Rewrite history like I had better options." "I didn't." Clara moved closer. "You saved my life, Cade. Maybe not in the dramatic way stories talk about, but you did. And tomorrow I'm going to stand in front of that judge and make sure he knows it." Cade looked at her for a long moment. Then he held out his hand. Clara took it. His palm was warm and rough against hers, calloused from work and steady despite everything. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he said quietly, "I want you to know I don't regret any of this. Not the marriage, not bringing you here, not any of it." "Good. Because I don't either." They stood like that in the dark kitchen, hands clasped, both knowing that tomorrow would either solidify what they'd built or destroy it completely. "We should try to sleep," Clara said eventually. "Yeah." But neither of them moved. They just stood there holding hands in the darkness, gathering strength for the fight ahead. When they finally went upstairs, Clara stopped at her bedroom door and looked back at Cade standing in the hallway. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up on this. On me." "I never could," Cade said, and the simple honesty in his voice made Clara's chest ache. She slept poorly, waking every hour to stare at the ceiling and rehearse answers to questions she could only guess at. When dawn finally came, she was exhausted but wired, running on nerves and determination. The ride to town felt both endless and too short. Cade drove the wagon in silence. His jaw set in that stubborn line Clara had learned meant he was fighting down fear. She sat beside him in her best dress, the green one she'd worn to the spring dance, and tried to keep her hands from shaking. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived. Half of Copper Hollow had turned out, either to support them or watch them fall apart. Clara couldn't tell which camp most people fell into and decided she didn't care. Wallace Grady stood on the courthouse steps with 2 lawyers in expensive suits, looking smug and confident. When he saw Clara, he smiled that same ugly smile that made her want to reach for the knife in her boot. "Mrs. Mercer," he called out. "Or should I say Miss Whitmore? We'll find out soon enough, won't we?" Cade's hand found Clara's elbow, steadying. "Ignore him." "I'm trying." Catherine Brennan met them inside, looking sharp and professional in a dark suit. "Remember what we talked about. Answer the questions directly. Don't volunteer extra information. And whatever Grady's lawyers say, don't let them rattle you." "Easy for you to say," Clara muttered. "I know it's not easy, but you can do this." Catherine looked between them. "Both of you can. Just tell the truth." Judge Harrison turned out to be a gray-haired man in his 60s with the kind of face that had seen too much human stupidity to be impressed by much of anything. He took his seat at the bench, surveyed the crowded courtroom with visible distaste, and banged his gavel once. "This is a petition hearing, not a circus," he said. "I'll have order or I'll clear the room. Understood?" The murmuring crowd went quiet. Harrison shuffled papers, put on reading glasses, and looked at Wallace Grady's lead lawyer. "Mr. Patterson, you filed this petition? Make your case." Clara's hands clenched in her lap. Cade sat beside her, perfectly still, but she could feel the tension radiating off him. "The marriage itself is questionable at best," Patterson continued. Frank Whitmore had no legal authority to consent on behalf of his niece. There was no parental consent, no court approval, just a desperate drunk selling his brother's child to settle his debts. This alone should invalidate the union. Harrison made a note. And your client's interest in this matter? My client, Mr. Wallace Grady, had a prior financial arrangement with Frank Whitmore regarding Miss Whitmore's care and future. When Mr. Mercer interfered with that arrangement, he effectively stole property that rightfully belonged to Mr. Clara felt sick. Property. That's what she was to these people. Property to be owned and traded. Catherine was on her feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. Miss Whitmore is a person, not property. This kind of language is exactly why. Sustained. Harrison looked at Patterson over his glasses. Choose your words more carefully, counselor. This is 1889, not 1859. Patterson inclined his head. Of course, Your Honor. My apologies. What I meant to say is that Mr. Grady had a legitimate claim to guardianship that was improperly usurped by Mr. Mercer's hasty and questionable marriage. And what is Mr. Grady seeking from this court? Dissolution of the marriage on grounds of improper consent and coercion, removal of Miss Whitmore from Mr. Mercer's custody, and appointment of Mr. Grady as her legal guardian until she reaches majority. Harrison turned to Catherine. Mrs. Brennan, your response? Catherine stood, and Clara noticed she wasn't as tall as Patterson, but somehow took up more space. Your Honor, this petition is a transparent attempt by a rejected suitor to acquire through legal manipulation what he couldn't obtain through legitimate means. The marriage between Clara Whitmore and Cade Mercer may have had unusual circumstances, but it is entirely legal and valid under territorial law. How do you figure that? First, while Frank Whitmore's authority as guardian is questionable, the marriage was performed by a licensed minister and witnessed by county officials. The paperwork was filed properly and accepted by the court at the time. If there were irregularities, they should have been challenged then, not months later when Mr. Grady decided he wanted another chance at acquisition. Harrison made another note. Continue. Second, and more importantly, Clara Whitmore, now Clara Mercer, is here today of her own free will, prepared to testify that she remains in this marriage by choice. She's had multiple opportunities to leave. She hasn't taken them. That alone should tell this court everything it needs to know about whether she's being held against her will. The defense would argue that she's been manipulated, Patterson interjected. Isolated from other options, made dependent. The defense can argue whatever it wants, Catherine cut him off. But we have witnesses prepared to testify that Mrs. Mercer is happy, healthy, well cared for, and demonstrably more independent and capable than she was under her uncle's care. Can Mr. Grady say the same about his treatment of his previous wives? The courtroom erupted in whispers. Patterson's face went red. Harrison banged his gavel. That's enough. Both of you sit down. We're going to hear testimony, and then I'll make my ruling. He looked at Clara. Mrs. Mercer, approach the bench. Clara stood on legs that felt like water. Cade's hand brushed hers as she passed, a brief touch of reassurance. Then she was alone, standing in front of the judge, while the entire town watched. Mrs. Mercer, Harrison said, not unkindly, I'm going to ask you some questions. Answer them honestly. If you don't understand something, say so. Don't guess. Clear? Yes, Your Honor. Good. First question. Did anyone force you to marry Cade Mercer? No, sir. Did your uncle pressure you, threaten you, or tell you that you had to marry him? Clara thought about Frank's drunken certainty that he'd done her a favor. My uncle told me I should be grateful, but he didn't threaten me. Did Mr. Mercer threaten you or pressure you in any way? No, sir. He told me I could leave if I wanted to. Harrison's eyebrows rose. He said that? When? The first day, and multiple times since. Clara's voice steadied. He gave me money and offered me a horse. He told me the marriage might not even be legal and I could challenge it if I wanted to. And did you want to? No, sir. Why not? Clara took a breath. Because the alternative was worse. My uncle was going to sell me to Mr. Grady. I'd heard stories about what happened to his previous wives. When Mr. Mercer offered me a different option, I took it. So you married him to escape Grady? At first, yes, but that's not why I stayed. Harrison leaned forward. Why did you stay? This was it. The moment Catherine had prepared her for. Clara looked out at the courtroom, at Wallace Grady's smug face, at Sarah Bellamy's pitying expression, at all the people who'd decided her story before she had a chance to tell it herself. Then she looked at Cade, sitting beside Catherine with his hands clenched on his knees and fear written all over his face. "I stayed because Mr. Mercer treated me like a person," Clara said clearly. "He gave me choices. He taught me skills. He never touched me without permission and never made me do anything I didn't want to do. He built me a workshop because he thought I might want space of my own. He let me handle the ranch correspondence because I was good at it, not because it was women's work." She paused. "He made me feel like my life belonged to me. That's why I stayed." The courtroom was silent. "And you're saying you want to remain married to him?" Harrison asked. "Yes, sir. By choice. My choice." Harrison made several notes, then looked up. "Thank you, Mrs. Mercer. You can sit down." He turned to Patterson. "Your witness." Patterson stood, and Clara's stomach dropped. This was the part Catherine had warned her about. "Mrs. Mercer," Patterson said, voice gentle and poisonous at once. "You're 16 years old, is that correct?" "Yes." "And Mr. Mercer is 32? "Yes." "So he's exactly twice your age. Does that seem appropriate to you?" Catherine was on her feet. "Objection. Relevance. I'm establishing the power dynamic, Your Honor." "I'll allow it. Answer the question, Mrs. Mercer." Clara met Patterson's eyes. "Age doesn't determine power. Respect does. Mr. Mercer has always treated me with respect. Even though he bought you from your uncle for $300? He paid my uncle's debt. That's different from buying a person." "Is it?" "Because it seems to me that a transaction took place, money changed hands, and you ended up in a man's house with very few options for leaving." "I had options. I still have options." "Do you?" Patterson moved closer. "You're in the middle of nowhere with no family, no money of your own, no prospects. If you left Mr. Mercer tomorrow, where would you go?" "Anywhere I wanted." "With what resources?" Catherine stood. "Objection, Your Honor. Mrs. Mercer is not on trial here." "Overruled. The question of her independence is relevant to whether this marriage is legitimate." Harrison looked at Clara. "Answer the question." Clara's mind raced. She thought about the money Cade had offered her, the horse, the rifle he'd taught her to shoot, the skills he'd made sure she learned. "Mr. Mercer gave me money," she said. "Enough to get to Silver Creek or further if I wanted. He taught me to ride, to shoot, to handle ranch work. I can read and write and manage finances. If I left tomorrow, I'd survive just fine." "But you haven't left." "No." "Why not?" "Because I don't want to." Clara's voice rose slightly. "I'm not staying because I'm trapped. I'm staying because this is the first place I've ever been allowed to be myself." Patterson smiled, and Clara knew she'd walked into something. "Be yourself. That's interesting. Tell me, Mrs. Mercer, in what ways has Mr. Mercer allowed you to be yourself?" Clara felt the trap closing. "I don't understand the question. Has he allowed you to make friends, to see people your own age, to have any life outside of his ranch?" "I can see anyone I want." "But you don't, do you? You stay isolated on that ranch, alone with a man twice your age. Some might call that grooming." The courtroom erupted. Harrison banged his gavel. Catherine was shouting objections. But all Clara could hear was the word grooming echoing in her head, twisting everything good into something ugly. "That's not what this is," she said, but her voice was lost in the chaos. Harrison restored order with effort. "Counselor, you're on thin ice. One more comment like that, and I'll hold you in contempt." "My apologies, Your Honor." Patterson didn't sound apologetic. "I'm simply trying to establish whether this young woman understands the nature of her situation." "I understand perfectly," Clara said, louder now. "You're trying to make it sound like I'm being taken advantage of. But the only person who ever tried to take advantage of me was the man paying your fee." She pointed at Wallace Grady. "Him. He wanted to own me. Mr. Mercer wanted to free me. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Because from where I'm standing—" "You're not standing anywhere that matters," Clara interrupted. "You don't know what my life was like before. You don't know what it's like now. You're just a lawyer getting paid to twist the truth into whatever shape your client wants." Harrison's gavel came down. "Mrs. Mercer, I understand you're upset, but you need to control yourself." Clara forced herself to breathe. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm sorry." Patterson looked satisfied. No further questions. Clara sat down beside Catherine, shaking with anger and fear. Cade's hand found hers under the table and squeezed. "You did good," Catherine whispered. "Better than good. It didn't feel good. It never does. But you held your ground. That matters." Harrison called Cade to the stand next, and Clara watched him walk forward with that same careful control he applied to everything. He looked calm, but Clara could see the tension in his shoulders. "Mr. Mercer," Harrison said, "tell me why you married Clara Whitmore." Cade's answer was direct. "Because I heard her uncle was selling her, and I knew what that would mean for her, so I made a better offer." "You bought her." "I paid Frank's debt. Then I married her to make sure Grady couldn't take her." Cade's voice was steady. "I'm not proud of how it happened, but I'm not sorry I did it." "And what were your intentions when you married a 16-year-old girl?" "To keep her safe, that's all." "Nothing else?" "No, sir." Patterson stood. "Your Honor, if I may?" "Mr. Mercer, you claim you married Clara purely to protect her. Is that correct?" "Yes." "And yet you've kept her isolated on your ranch for months, limited her contact with others, made her dependent on you for everything." "That's not true, isn't it? She has no income of her own, no property, no legal rights except those you allow her." Cade's jaw tightened. "She has rights. She has choices. I've made sure of that." "Have you? Or have you simply created the illusion of choice while maintaining complete control?" "I don't control her." "No? Let me ask you this, Mr. Mercer. If Clara decided tomorrow she wanted to leave, would you let her go?" "Yes." "Just like that? No argument, no pressure?" "Just like that." Patterson smiled. "And yet she hasn't left, despite being 16 years old, married to a stranger, living in isolation. Why do you think that is?" "You'd have to ask her." "I did ask her. She said you make her feel like her life belongs to her. But doesn't that strike you as odd? That a 16-year-old girl feels more ownership of her life under your control than she would living independently?" "I don't control her," Cade repeated, voice harder now. "Then what do you call it?" "Partnership." The word hung in the air. Patterson looked delighted. "Partnership. Between a 32-year-old man and a teenage girl. Some might call that inappropriate." Cade's hands curled into fists. Clara could see him fighting to stay calm, to not give Patterson the outburst he was clearly baiting for. "Some people," Cade said carefully, "judge situations they don't understand. Clara is the smartest, most capable person I know. Age doesn't change that. But it does change the power dynamic. The only power I have is what she gives me, and she can take it back any time. Can she? Or have you made sure she's too dependent to survive without you? That did it." Cade leaned forward, voice low and dangerous. "I've spent months making sure she can survive without me, teaching her skills, giving her resources. The exact opposite of making her dependent." "Why?" "Because that's what you do when you care about someone. You make them stronger, not weaker." Patterson paused, recalibrating. "You care about her?" Cade realized he'd walked into it too late. "Yes." "In what way?" "In every way that matters." "She's not a child," Cade interrupted. "She's young, yes, but she's survived more than most adults will face in a lifetime. She's earned the right to be treated like a person capable of making her own decisions. Even if those decisions are to stay with a man who has romantic feelings for her, a man with a history of violence," Cade's expression went cold. "My history is a matter of public record. I killed a man who murdered my mother. The sheriff ruled it self-defense. If you want to use that against me, go ahead, but don't pretend it's relevant to whether I'm a suitable guardian for Clara." "Isn't it? Violence begets violence, Mr. Mercer. How long before—" Catherine was on her feet. "Objection. Counsel is speculating." "Sustained." Harrison looked at Patterson. "Move on or sit down." Patterson sat down looking satisfied. The damage was done. Harrison called several other witnesses. Sheriff Mitchell, who testified that he had never seen evidence of abuse or coercion. Mrs. Patterson, who admitted Clara seemed healthier and happier than under Frank's care. Even the minister who'd performed the ceremony, who stated that while unusual, the marriage had been conducted legally. Then Wallace Grady took the stand, and Clara had to watch him lie with a straight face about his intentions and his character and his deep concern for her welfare. "I only want what's best for Clara," he said, voice dripping with false sincerity. "She deserves a proper guardian, someone who can provide for her without expecting anything inappropriate in return. Catherine's cross-examination was brutal. She brought up the deaths of his previous wives, the rumors of abuse, the fact that he'd offered money for Clara like she was livestock. By the time she was done, Grady was red-faced and sweating, his veneer of respectability thoroughly shredded, but Clara couldn't tell if it was enough. Finally, after 3 hours of testimony, Harrison called for closing arguments. Patterson went first, painting Cade as a predator and Clara as a victim too manipulated to see it. Catherine followed, framing the marriage as an imperfect solution to an impossible situation that had grown into something genuine and worth protecting. Then Harrison retired to his chambers to deliberate. The wait was agony. Clara sat beside Cade in the hallway outside the courtroom, neither of them speaking, both running through every possible outcome and its consequences. After 45 minutes, Harrison's clerk summoned them back inside. The judge looked tired as he took his seat. He shuffled papers for a moment, then looked directly at Clara. "This is not an easy case," he said. "The circumstances are unusual, the age difference is concerning, and there are legitimate questions about the propriety of this marriage." He paused. "However, after hearing testimony and reviewing the evidence, I'm struck by one unavoidable fact. Clara Mercer is demonstrably better off now than she was under her uncle's care. She's healthier, more educated, more independent. And most importantly, she's here of her own free will, clearly and convincingly stating her desire to remain in this marriage." Clara's heart started to pound. "The petition claims Mr. Mercer has manipulated or coerced her," Harrison continued. "But I see no evidence of that. What I see is a young woman who has been given unusual freedom and has used it to build a life for herself. That is not coercion. That is opportunity." Wallace Grady leaned forward, face darkening. "As for Mr. Grady's claim to guardianship," Harrison said, voice hardening slightly, "I find it laughable. This court will not award custody of a young woman to a man with his reputation, regardless of any financial arrangements he made with her uncle. Those arrangements were invalid from the start." Clara felt Cade's hand find hers. "Therefore," Harrison said, "the petition to dissolve the marriage is denied. The marriage between Clara Whitmore and Cade Mercer is valid and will remain so. Mrs. Mercer is free to stay or leave as she chooses, but that choice belongs to her alone." He looked at Wallace Grady. "And Mr. Grady, if you come before my court again with this nonsense, I'll hold you in contempt. Are we clear?" Grady's face was purple with rage, but he nodded stiffly. Harrison banged his gavel. "This hearing is concluded." The courtroom erupted. Clara heard cheering from some corners, angry muttering from others. But all she could focus on was Cade's hand in hers and the fact that they'd won. They'd actually won. Catherine appeared beside them, grinning. "Congratulations! You're officially married." Clara laughed, surprising herself. "We were officially married before. Now you're officially married, with judicial approval." Catherine gathered her papers. "Grady might try to appeal, but it won't go anywhere. Harrison's ruling is solid." Outside the courthouse, people clustered in groups, talking in hushed voices. Some nodded at Clara and Cade as they passed. Others looked away. A few, Sarah Bellamy among them, just stared with expressions Clara couldn't quite read. Wallace Grady stood by his horse, surrounded by his lawyers. When he saw Clara, his expression twisted into something ugly. "This isn't over," he called out. "You think you've won, but you haven't. You're still just a—" "Mr. Grady," Sheriff Mitchell appeared, hand on his gun belt. "I think you should leave town, now, before you say something that gets you arrested." Grady stared at Clara for a long moment, then mounted his horse and rode away without another word. Clara watched him go and felt nothing but relief. On the ride home, Clara and Cade sat in silence for the first mile. Then Clara started laughing, helpless, slightly hysterical laughter that she couldn't stop. "What's funny?" Cade asked. "Nothing. Everything. We just convinced a judge that our disaster of a marriage is legitimate." She wiped her eyes. "It's absurd." "It is absurd," Cade agreed, "but it's also true." Clara sobered. "You meant it, didn't you? What you said in there, about caring about me in every way that matters." Cade's hands tightened on the reins. "Yes, that's terrifying. I know. But also good, really good." Cade glanced at her. "Yeah?" "Yeah." Clara leaned her head against his shoulder, too tired to worry about what the gesture meant. "We're officially stuck with each other now. Could be worse. Could be a lot worse. They rode the rest of the way home in comfortable silence, and when they pulled into the ranch yard, Clara felt something settle in her chest that she'd never felt before. Not just safety, not just relief, something bigger and more complicated and undeniably real. Home. This was home. That night they celebrated with the bottle of whiskey Cade had been saving for God knows what occasion. They sat at the kitchen table and drank and talked about everything and nothing, about the hearing, about Grady's face when the judge ruled against him, about what happened next. "So now what?" Clara asked, slightly tipsy and warm from the fire. "Now we keep doing what we've been doing, running the ranch, living our lives." Cade refilled her glass. "Except now nobody can question it. People will always question it." "Let them." He raised his glass. "To not caring what people think." Clara clinked her glass against his. "To choices. And consequences. And partnerships." "And partnerships," Clara echoed. They drank, and Clara felt the whiskey settle warm in her stomach alongside something else. Something that felt like hope and possibility and the beginning of whatever came after surviving. "I burned the annulment papers," she said suddenly. "The ones you gave me. I threw them in the fire." Cade set down his glass. "I know. I saw. Are you angry?" "No." He looked at her directly. "I'm relieved." "Why?" "Because I didn't want you to leave. I just needed you to have the option." Clara thought about that. About freedom, meaning not just the ability to leave, but the choice to stay. About how the strongest bonds were the ones you walked into willingly instead of being dragged into against your will. "I'm not leaving," she said. "Not now, not next month, not when I turn 18. She paused. "Maybe not ever." "Clara, I mean it. I know I am young. I know this is all kinds of complicated, but I also know I'm happier here with you than I've ever been anywhere." She reached across the table and took his hand. "So unless you're planning to kick me out, you're stuck with me." Cade's fingers closed around hers. "I'm not kicking you out." "Good." They sat like that, hands clasped across the table, the fire crackling in the background. Outside, night settled over the valley in layers of darkness and stars. "What you said in court," Clara ventured, "about caring about me, about maybe being in love. Did you mean that?" Cade was quiet for so long Clara thought he might not answer. Then, "I don't know if what I feel is love. I don't have much experience with it. But I know I think about your happiness before my own. I know I'd do just about anything to keep you safe. And I know the idea of you not being here makes everything feel wrong." He looked at her. "So yeah, I guess I meant it." Clara's heart was beating so hard she could hear it. "I don't know if what I feel is love either, but I know I trust you more than anyone I've ever met. I know I'm only really myself when you're around. And I know that whatever this is between us, I want to keep it. Even though it started wrong? Maybe it started wrong, but it doesn't have to end wrong." Clara stood up, still holding his hand, and moved around the table until she was standing beside his chair. "Can I try something?" "What kind of something?" Instead of answering, Clara leaned down and kissed him. It was clumsy and tentative and probably terrible by any objective standard. But Cade's hand came up to cup her face, gentle and careful, and he kissed her back like she was something precious and breakable and worth protecting. When they broke apart, they stayed close, foreheads touching. "Was that okay?" Clara whispered. "That was more than okay." "Good, because I've been wanting to do that for weeks." Cade's thumb brushed her cheek. "Me too, but I didn't want to push. I know, that's one of the things I love about you." The word slipped out before Clara could stop it. "One of the things I think might be love. I'm still figuring it out." "Take your time. We've got time." "Do we?" "Because earlier today we almost lost everything." "But we didn't." Cade pulled back to look at her properly. "We fought for this, both of us, and we won." Clara smiled. "Yeah, we did. They stayed up late that night, talking and laughing and slowly figuring out how to be married people who actually chose each other. When Clara finally went upstairs, she left her door open, and for the first time she heard Cade's footsteps come up after her. He paused at her doorway. "Can I say goodnight properly?" Clara held out her hand. Cade took it, pulled her close, and kissed her like they had all the time in the world to figure this out. "Good night, Clara." "Good night, Cade." He went to his own room. Clara lay in bed listening to him move around, the sounds of another person sharing her space feeling right instead of threatening. And for the first time in her entire life, Clara fell asleep without any fear at all. The months that followed the hearing were better than Clara had let herself imagine. Spring turned to summer, and the ranch came alive with work and purpose. Clara took over more of the business side, her correspondence with buyers and suppliers becoming sharp and efficient. Cade taught her more about ranching, the harder skills, the judgment calls, the things you could only learn by doing them wrong a few times first. They worked side by side through long days, building something that felt like a real partnership. The town's opinion slowly shifted from scandal to grudging acceptance. Not everyone approved, but most people stopped talking about it. Claire and Cade became just another married couple trying to make a life work in hard country. What changed between them happened gradually. Cade stopped sleeping downstairs. They learned each other slowly, carefully, with a patience that came from knowing they had time. Clara turned 17 that summer, and Cade built her a bigger workshop because the first one had gotten too small for all her projects. Some nights they'd sit on the porch and watch the sunset over the valley, and Clara would think about how far she'd come from that terrified girl being dragged to a courthouse, how much she'd changed, how much they'd both changed. "What are you thinking?" Cade asked one evening. "That I'm glad he came to that saloon, the night you heard about Grady." "Yeah?" "Yeah, I'm glad you made that offer to Frank. I'm glad you married me even though it was crazy and probably illegal and definitely complicated." Clara took his hand. "I'm glad I ended up here." Cade brought her hand to his lips. "Me too." "You don't regret any of it?" "Not anymore. At first, maybe. I kept thinking I'd ruined your life." He looked at her. "But you didn't let me. You took this mess and turned it into something good. We both did that." "Maybe. But you were braver about it." Clara laughed. "I wasn't brave. I was desperate. Desperate people don't stand up to Wallace Grady in the middle of a fair. They don't burn annulment papers. They don't fight for something they're not sure will work." Cade pulled her closer. "You were brave. You still are." By the time Clara turned 18, their marriage had become what marriages were supposed to be. Two people choosing each other every day, building a life from shared work and trust, and whatever this feeling was that kept growing between them. The winter after the hearing brought its own challenges. A brutal storm system moved through the territory in December, dumping snow and ice for 3 days straight. The town sent word that they needed help, families trapped, livestock freezing, supply routes cut off. Clara and Cade didn't hesitate. They loaded the wagon with everything they could spare and headed into town through conditions that probably should have killed them. What they found was chaos. The church had become a makeshift shelter, packed with families who'd lost their homes or couldn't reach them. The general store was running out of food. People were scared and cold and desperate. Clara took charge without thinking about it. She organized the supplies they'd brought, assigned people to tasks, set up a system for rationing food and distributing blankets. The same organizational skills she'd been using to run the ranch translated perfectly to managing a crisis. Cade led rescue missions through the storm, pulling people out of collapsed buildings and snowed-in houses. He'd come back half frozen, rest for an hour, then head out again. Clara would force food and hot coffee into him, check for frostbite, and send him back out with better gear. They worked like that for 5 days straight, Clara coordinating from the church, Cade leading the dangerous work outside. The people who'd once whispered about their scandalous marriage now depended on them to survive. When the storm finally broke, Copper Hollow was a different place. Families who'd lost everything had been saved. Children who would have frozen had been kept warm. And the two people everyone had once pitied or condemned had proven themselves in the way frontier towns respected most, through work and courage when it mattered. The town council held a meeting after everything settled down. They thanked Clara and Cade publicly, which was awkward for both of them. But more than that, they made it clear that whatever questions they'd had about the Mercers were answered. They were part of the community now, accepted, respected. Wallace Grady had left the territory by then, drove out by reputation and debt, and the knowledge that he'd lost the only battle that mattered to him. Nobody missed him. Clara stood in the church hall, exhausted and dirty and proud of what they'd accomplished, and realized something fundamental had changed. She wasn't the scared girl being rescued anymore. She was the woman doing the rescuing. And Cade wasn't the isolated rancher everyone feared. He was the man they called on when things got desperate. They'd both become who they needed to be, together. That spring, almost 2 years after their wedding, Clara and Cade stood in the workshop he'd built for her, now filled with sewing projects and half-finished furniture and all the evidence of a life being lived on purpose. "I've been thinking," Clara said, "about the future." "What about it?" "About what comes next, after we finish proving ourselves to everyone," Cade smiled. "I think we're done proving ourselves." "Good, because I'm tired of it." Clara moved closer. "I want to just live, raise some kids eventually, if that's something you want." "Kids? Or not? We've got time to figure it out." She took his hand. "I just mean I want to stop surviving and start actually living." Cade pulled her close. "I want that too." "Yeah?" "Yeah. I've spent too long just existing. You made me want more than that." Clara kissed him, comfortable and familiar and full of promise. "So let's do it. Let's build something that's ours. Not because we have to, but because we want to." And they did. Years later, when people asked Clara about her marriage, and they did ask because it had become something of a legend in the territory, she never sugarcoated it. She told them the truth. That it started wrong. That she'd been too young and he'd been too damaged, and neither of them had known what they were doing. But she also told them that sometimes the wrong start led to the right ending. That freedom wasn't about being alone. It was about choosing who you walked beside. That strength wasn't about never needing help. It was about building something together that neither person could build alone. She told them that Cade Mercer had given her the greatest gift anyone ever had. Not safety, not security, but choice. The choice to stay or go. The choice to be herself without apology. The choice to build a life on her own terms with a partner who respected her enough to let her. And in the end, that choice had made all the difference. The ranch grew over the years. They added cattle, expanded the land, built a real house to replace the original one. They weathered droughts and hard winters and all the challenges that came with frontier life. Sometimes it was beautiful, sometimes it was brutal, but they faced it together as equals, as partners, as people who'd chosen each other not once, but every single day. And in the quiet mountains of the frontier, where survival often turned people cruel and hard, Clara and Cade proved something that the whole territory would remember, that the strongest bonds weren't forged in perfection. They were forged in struggle, in choice, in the daily decision to see another person as they truly were and love them anyway. Not because it was easy, but because it was worth it,